Special thanks goes to my brother. He was the only person who at least tried to support me in the beginning stages of this project. Apart from that, there aren't really many people to thank. It took much longer than I wished, but I made this whole thing happen entirely by myself. If there's anyone to thank, it's you for taking the time to read this. So thank you.
Before we get into this book's subject matter, there are a few things you've got to know. First off, the idea promoted in this book is a hypothesis, not a theory, and yes, there's a difference. Some of you might already be aware, but in the world of science, a theory is not an unfounded possibility, although that's how many people use the term. Instead, a theory in science is something that's been widely accepted. The main idea expressed in this book is therefore a hypothesis. It's entirely my own work, and as of the time of this recording, it hasn't been scientifically proven, at least as far as I know. I will be citing studies throughout the chapters to support my arguments, but these studies will be limited in number and aren't meant to be taken as definitive proof. Secondly, this hypothesis is not meant to be a unified or catch-all sort of thesis. In other words, it's not meant to answer all of the big questions brain scientists currently face. When I was first writing this book, I thought my hypothesis might be a unified theory of psychology. I certainly wanted it to be that. But over time, I've had to acknowledge that the concepts I've developed just don't meet that criteria. Even if my ideas are correct, there are still major issues in psychology that need to be solved and explained. For instance, this hypothesis doesn't explain the phenomenon of consciousness. I discuss why in Chapter 6. My thesis also doesn't give a solution to the problem of the decision maker, a problem I'll go over in Chapter 5. So what does this book do? This book simply proposes and explains an idea. The idea that nervous systems evolved as a way for organisms to assign values. In other words, that value assignment is the brain's first and most fundamental function. Why does this idea matter? Well, the truth is, on a purely mechanical level, many aspects of brain function are actually well understood by scientists and psychologists today. What isn't yet well understood or well agreed on is how a nervous system's mechanical activity translates into thoughts, actions, and experiences. This is also referred to as higher level or higher order brain function. There's much speculation about how that translation works, and even some research to back it up, but there isn't a massive consensus about it in the scientific community yet. If my thesis is correct, it might aid with or possibly simplify certain elements of translation. And of course, this thesis could also answer the age-old question, why do brains exist? As in, what's their evolutionary purpose? But this thesis won't be a panacea. It won't fully decipher the puzzle that is our brain. At best, it will only orient a few pieces. The third point I want to make is that I'm not an expert on the brain. I don't have a doctorate in psychology, neuroscience, or any related fields. I didn't even finish college. Really, I'm just somebody who was massively curious about this subject and wanted to understand my own experience of the world. So then how did this book happen? Some of you may be interested in hearing where this book came from and what caused me to write it, so I figure I'll explain it here. If you're not interested in hearing my origin story, skip to the next point of the introduction. I have autism. No, not the sarcastic kind, not the kind that people use as an insult to belittle others' intelligence in online debates, the kind which would generally be diagnosed by a licensed psychiatrist. Only I had the misfortune of not knowing this until I was 28. Growing up, psychology wasn't something that people around me talked about, as in, ever. There were no psychology classes I went to in elementary or high school, possibly because my highly religious school didn't prioritize it. There were no internet forums where I could go to voice my troubles. I grew up pre-internet, and even as the internet became more widespread, I didn't really have great access to it until college. And my parents definitely didn't help. As far as I was concerned, before the age of 18, the entire concept of psychology didn't exist, even though others had clearly treated me like I was different my whole life. I just didn't know why. But when I took a Psych 101 class during my freshman year of college, something interesting happened. After attending that introductory class, after realizing that there were aspects of our mind and behavior that had been scientifically researched, dissected, and explained, I thought psychology could be my way out, my path to becoming normal. I was still unaware that I had autism, but I figured, if no one is going to help me with whatever it is I'm going through, I'll just have to fix it myself. Little did I know how much this decision would impact my life. After that 101 class, my interest in psychology skyrocketed. I was completely obsessed, and I wanted to know everything I could. The issue is, psychology isn't really one subject. There are many different areas of research and analysis which go into it, many complexities which make the human mind a labyrinth to solve. But at the time, I was unaware of that. In my naivete, I thought there might be a way to cut to the heart, a basic framework for understanding the mind which might dramatically simplify the learning process. Essentially, I wanted to get my hands on some kind of model or theory which explained the most basic elements of psychology and which could be applied universally to all people and all minds. But where does one go to find that? Well, back then, I thought, if you want to understand any kind of system, including psychology, you should probably start at the smallest level possible. And psychology, assumably, starts with brain function. So I began searching for a universal theory of brain function. I didn't even think it would be hard to find. I thought, surely, at this point in human history, someone must have invented a unified model which explains the basics of what the brain does and how it operates. However, as I went over the literature, it became clear that there were many more unsolved problems than I was expecting. Instead of a scientific consensus, what I found was that the models and frameworks brain theorists used to explain brain function, as well as their general ideas about psychology, differed from each other, sometimes dramatically. The simple universal framework I was looking for simply wasn't there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some solution to these problems. It couldn't just be that there's no answer. I couldn't accept that premise. I believed, and still believe, that all observable things in the universe must have some explanation, even if we haven't found it. So I did something unusual, and something I wouldn't necessarily advise others to do. I started crafting my own ideas about psychology. In my defense, I was still practically a kid, and it wasn't like I was intending to show anyone these ideas, at least not at the time. Initially, my ideas were just notes I wrote to myself and worked on when I had a moment. But eventually, almost inevitably, I wanted to make my ideas better. So I started weighing my ideas against each other to find contradictions or make improvements. I would then compare my updated ideas with relevant science. Once I felt like they were solid, I wanted to merge my ideas into a single framework. So I began constructing entire psychological models, and then revising those models, all in my spare time, until after 3 years in college, I had built the basics of this thesis. At a certain point, it became clear to me that these models I'd been working on, along with various other ideas I'd written down, were what I really cared about more than anything I was doing in school. But of course, once I realized this, I had to make a choice: continue down the road of a traditional education, or quit school to hone in on my writing. I think you can guess which one I chose. In fact, it was the day I turned 21 when I dropped out of college and drove 2 states back to my parents' house to focus on this. I didn't even take my final exams. What I didn't realize was that it would take far, far longer to finish this book than I originally thought. There's a whole separate story about what I did after college, but the short version is, I spent the next 4 years living with my parents trying to learn how to write. At 25, with only $400 in my pocket, I moved to another city. I then spent the next 9 years doing manual labor jobs, trying to survive, while working on this thesis when I could. It was during this time that I finally found out that I had autism spectrum disorder, formerly known as Asperger's syndrome. Too little too late when I think about it now. If I'd been aware of this earlier, maybe I could have accelerated this book's writing process. In my case, autism had a substantial impact on my ability to understand communication, which made it extremely difficult to learn to write. But if I'd known, I may also have never come up with this thesis to begin with. It's all speculation at this point. In any case, the book is now done, and it's taken nearly half my life to complete. But, as lovely as this story might be, there's one thing it doesn't change. A scientific hypothesis can always be wrong. My ideas have never been peer-reviewed. I cobbled them together entirely from my own efforts and ingenuity. As a result, there could be flaws in my perspective that I don't see, factors which I fail to consider, or scientific evidence out there which goes against my hypothesis. Ultimately, no matter what I do, I can't avoid the fact that I took a highly abnormal route to reach these conclusions, so in good conscience, I must advise you to take this whole thing with a grain of salt. Despite that, I think you'll find my arguments are clear, cogent, and follow a simple logical path, which means, even if I'm wrong, the stuff I'm talking about should at least make sense. Fourth, this book wasn't just written for people who do science, it was made to be widely accessible. In other words, I wrote it so almost anyone, anywhere, could read it and easily understand it. Why did I write it that way? Well, basically, I want my thesis to be available and useful to the most number of people. So if you're worried that this book is going to be overly sciencey and hard to grasp, rest assured that almost every part of it has been painstakingly revised so that even an 8th grader can comprehend what I'm talking about. Of course, the book is still meant to convey a scientific idea at the end of the day, so there will be some situations where I use technical definitions and wording in the main text. However, anytime I do this, the things I'm talking about will be explained in clear terms right afterward. Carat section 0.1, the intro carat section. This is probably another reason why the thesis took me so long to write. Making a work that's not only scientifically useful, but that's also interesting, well presented, naturally flowing, grammatically sound, technically accurate, concise enough to be readable, but thorough enough to explain all the relevant details, and something that almost anyone can understand while starting out with a severe communication impairment. Well, let's just say that wasn't a cakewalk. Another thing to mention. As you continue reading, you're going to come across sections like the one I just read, with a number attached to them. These sections will be either for A, adding further commentary to a topic, or B, discussing definitions and technicalities. As for what the number means, the first digit indicates the chapter number, and the second digit indicates the carat section number within that chapter. For instance, the carat section I just read is 0.1 because it's the first carat section in chapter 0, the introduction. If I added a carat section after this paragraph, that carat section would be number 0.2, and so on. These carat sections are the only parts of the book that are not necessarily going to be easily readable. The good thing is, if you're only interested in the basic ideas of the hypothesis, these sections aren't mandatory to read. I've written the book in such a way that it works without them. Still, for those who want a fuller picture of the thesis, the carat sections will pretty much be a requirement. Lastly, to conclude the intro, there's one more thing I have to mention. The whole concept that this book revolves around, the concept of value assignment, is not actually new. Before I ever started this project, the notion of values already existed in the world of psychology. Although it doesn't get a whole ton of media attention, like gravity or consciousness, value assignment is a process that psychologists and brain theorists have speculated about before. So if others have already talked about it, what makes this book and my ideas unique? Two things. First off, within the realm of psychology, the people who discuss values are often defining value in linear or numeric terms. In other words, they're treating value as something negative or positive, or something with a number attached to it. For example, a value of 0 or 1. These same people also usually think that there's some sort of value ranking system in the brain where positive or higher number values are placed above negative or lower number values. Unfortunately, I don't believe value in the brain is linear or numeric in nature, and I don't think brains or nervous systems rank values in a universally predictable or universally consistent manner. I think that brains can sense information in a relatively consistent manner across a species. I also believe that certain psychological predispositions, such as the fear response, can appear consistently within a species, most likely because brain structure and neural circuitry can be affected by genetics. Furthermore, I think it's possible for people to describe or model values in linear and numeric ways, which is something a programmer might do in order to create an artificial intelligence system. But I believe that in biological systems, value is a fundamentally non-linear trait. And I think there's a very straightforward argument for why that's the case, an argument which will be detailed in the upcoming chapter. Secondly, my thesis asserts that value assignment may be the brain's primary function, and no one else, as far as I'm aware, has made that same claim. The few times I've heard psychologists and brain theorists talk about value assignment, they mention it as just one of the functions the brain performs or may perform. Now yes, you could argue that brain cells serve a whole host of functions, and that value assignment is just one of them. But I believe that value assignment is far more significant than most people, including scientists, realize. I believe it's so significant that we might be able to think of the brain as a system which evolved mainly for the purpose of carrying out value assignment. Of course, someone else could have already made that claim. There might be some obscure essay buried deep in the halls of Transylvania outlining my exact ideas. I don't know. But in all my efforts, in all the sleepless nights I've spent studying this subject, I haven't found a single article, paper, or publication making such a proposal. So that's why this book exists, to explain why value assignment may be the brain's primary function. And if such a hypothesis has already been laid out by someone else, well then this book can simply serve to support it. Now, with all that out of the way, we can begin. Chapter 1, The Definition of Value. The title of this book is Value Assignment, the Primary Function of the Brain, so to start everything off, it would probably make sense to explain what value is first. The word value has many definitions in the English language, and the things it can refer to are pretty wide-ranging. If you tried to sit down and list all of those things, that list might get a bit long. You have financial value, sentimental value, mathematic value, binary values used in computer programming, moral value, value as in the general worth of something, values as in the ideals someone has and the things they prioritize. There also appears to be a psychotic number of fast food advertisements where the term value is used as a selling point. But for the purposes of this book, the word value will have only one definition: the autonomous relational interpretation of sensory information by a subjective observer. Now yes, at first glance, this definition probably sounds highly complicated, but once you get past the flashy terms, it's actually a pretty simple and easy to comprehend idea. I'll break the definition down into two parts. First, I'll explain what a subjective observer is, then I'll explain what autonomous relational interpretation of sensory information means, because that's the most daunting part of the definition. In short, a subjective observer is any being, entity, implement, or instrument, alive or not, that can detect things around it. There are three main characteristics a subjective observer has. A, it takes up a limited space. B, it relies on some specific mechanism or mechanisms to detect information. And C, it can only sense a limited amount as well as a limited type of info in its environment using that mechanism. You don't have to memorize these characteristics, they're just here for the sake of accuracy. Carat section 1.1, the definition of information. I'm defining information, aka regular information, or data, as any discrete object, phenomenon, or physical force which can be sensed or measured, and I'm defining sensory information, or sensory data, as the activation of a sensory mechanism or mechanisms usually in response to regular information. These definitions are meant solely for this book as a point of reference. They are not intended to replace any academic definitions used in other scientific fields. Why is sensory information defined the way it is? Because of the possibility of hallucinations. Sensory information seems, to the subjective observer, to represent actual information in the world. However, due to the way some sensory systems work, it's possible for a sensory system/mechanism to hallucinate or be activated without regular information doing the activation. This means information is not always required for a sensory signal to exist. But regardless of whether regular information is present or not, when a sensory mechanism is activated, that signal will always appear like information to the subjective observer. And this type of info can be, and often is, acted upon. As a result, I think it makes sense to treat any sensory signal as its own form of information, thus the term sensory information. And before you say it, yes, all subjective observers are technically composed of information. But even though subjective observers are info, the discernment of info is an entirely separate process which requires sensory mechanisms. This is why info and sensory info are considered separate things. There are many things in the world that can count as a subjective observer, but there's a specific word here we need to focus on, which is subjective. Now, in general, I think most people are familiar with what subjectivity is, but just so we're all on the same page, I'll give a brief explanation. Imagine if you put two fish together side by side and pointed their eyes at a rock. Even though they're both looking at the same thing, technically their perception of the rock would not be the same. Because there's a tiny distance between the heads of the two fish, the angle at which they're viewing the rock will be slightly different, causing their sensory perception of the rock to be slightly different. No matter where you place the two fish, this will always be true, even if both fish can detect the same types of information. For the two fish to see the exact same thing at the exact same moment, they would have to be the exact same fish. Of course, in reality, there are more factors involved in sensory perception. But, if anything, those factors will just create even more differences between the perspectives of the two fish, so the example still holds true. Basically, all things in the universe are physically separate from each other, and because of that separation, different things will almost always have different perspectives and/or traits. Carat section 1.2 further comments on subjectivity. Exactly how subjectivity works is another debate entirely. There's a whole array of questions you could ask if you wanted to really explore this topic, questions which dip into the very nature of matter and experience. For instance, if an entity is made up of many smaller cells, and if each of those cells are made up of many smaller parts, is the whole thing subjective or just its parts? Why is it possible for beings with many individual sensory nodes to have one single subjective experience of the world? Is everything in the universe actually separate from everything else? Because many of the ideas postulated in quantum physics would seem to challenge this notion. If things are separate, is it merely physical separation that births subjective experience? If not, what else factors in? If things aren't separate, how would subjectivity be possible? Depending on the scale you're observing, it appears to be the case that many things in the universe are separate, and that organisms can have subjective experiences. So where does that appearance come from? Would it be possible for a discrete object/entity to behave non-subjectively? If so, how? Still, in the interest of advancement, I'm going to work on the assumption that subjectivity does exist, since it seems to affect experience, and is largely a result of local disparity at the atomic scale and higher. I'm defining local disparity as an entity, object, or sensor's physical separation from other entities, objects, and sensors, not occupying the same space as another thing with a similar physical structure at the same time or while in the same physical state/position. Obviously, this definition does not account for any phenomenon in the quantum realm. At this point, you might be wondering, why are you talking about subjectivity? We all know that everything in the universe is separate from everything else. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because subjectivity has to do with value. See, every organism has to achieve certain big goals if it wants to keep itself and its species alive. For example, nearly all living creatures spend energy simply by existing, so they need some way of replacing that energy in order to survive. This is commonly done through a process called eating. Also, organisms can't usually stay alive forever, so they need some way to spawn more of themselves to keep the species alive. We call this reproduction. These big goals, survival and reproduction, can also be called biological goals. And in order to achieve biological goals, sometimes organisms will need to complete small or indirect tasks, such as hunting or farming. The problem is, subjectivity doesn't exactly make it easy to accomplish biological goals and tasks. In fact, because of subjectivity, there are two difficulties all creatures must deal with. Number 1, because everything in the universe is separate from everything else, the things that creatures need to achieve their goals will always exist in a separate place, at a separate time, or in a separate state from their current selves. Number 2, not all information will be or can be helpful in achieving an organism's goals. Basically, because we live in such a gigantic and varying universe with so much stuff, some information is always going to be irrelevant when it comes to any goal or task. So since every creature must deal with these two difficulties, it means that every creature, to accomplish goals and tasks, will have to either seek out what it needs, or at least filter out irrelevant information that gets thrown its way. But most importantly, if an organism happens to come across what it's seeking, there needs to be something inside the organism that tells it that it's found what it's looking for. Something that basically says, hey, this information over here isn't irrelevant, so that the organism can then take appropriate action. Because if you can't tell which info is important to act on, i.e. which things will help you accomplish your goals, you can do very little with the information you sense. This is where value comes into play. Let's say I'm a little animal that's just popped into existence knowing nothing about this universe. Right now, I just want to figure out where I am, what's going on, and how I can survive in this universe. But almost immediately, I run into a strange-looking clump of stuff, and it appears to be moving. I've got no clue what this clump of stuff is made of or what it's doing here, but I now have a predicament. I have to decide what to do about this thing in front of me. The problem is, I've never been to this universe before, and I know nothing about it. So if I'm completely clueless about my situation, how can I make a decision that's advantageous? Well, in order to take some action that might benefit me, I need something to base my actions on. Otherwise, anything I do will be a guess. Which means, before I make any moves, the first thing I should probably do is figure out how the information in front of me relates to me and my goals. Is this clump of stuff dangerous? Is it completely harmless? Is it actually alive? Is something else causing it to move? Will it try to kill me if I flee? Is it something I can eat? Does the existence of this clump in any way have to do with my survival? If so, how? By determining that relationship, the relationship between A, the information I'm sensing, and B, my goals, I'll have something to base my actions on. So where does that relationship come from? How do I obtain it? I could try to extract the relationship from maybe the universe or from the clump of stuff. But how would that work? What tools would I use to perform that kind of extraction? Is there a specific bone in my arm which does that? Or maybe the relationship could just teleport into my mind. It sure would make my life a lot easier. This whole extraction thing sounds like it should be simple and straightforward, but it actually wouldn't be, and the reason why has to do with neutrality. When it comes down to it, all things in the universe are ultimately just collections of data, including this clump of stuff. And data, on its own at least, doesn't really know about or care about my goals. It can't know what I want or what will help me survive. Data is neutral. This means no matter what information or data I'm looking at, the data by itself can't do anything for me. Carat section 1.3, the definition of neutrality. To be more specific, when I say that information or data is neutral, what I mean is, prior to value, both sensory and non-sensory information most likely contains no inherent qualities that a subjective observer can use to determine its own behavior. How do we know that? We can infer it from basic observation. Take language, for example. If I said the word airport, you'd probably know what place in the world I'm talking about. Of course, you know what the word airport means because you know English. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be reading this right now. But imagine if I went to an uncontacted tribe in the middle of the Amazon rainforest and said the word airport. Would they understand what I'm talking about? Probably not. To you, the word airport is associated with a specific place or building. But to a person who doesn't know English, the word airport is just going to sound like a bunch of noise. Well, here's the thing. Technically, the word airport is just a bunch of noise. The reason English speakers understand it is because they've learned to mentally match that noise with a particular thing in the world. But there's most likely no inherent meaning which exists inside the word airport, or any word for that matter. Here's another example. Let's say a cute baby bunny falls off a cliff. Is gravity going to suddenly stop itself so that the bunny can survive the fall? Most likely not, because the physical forces of the universe are ultimately just information. They have no biases, positive or negative, toward you or any other creature. The point is, all information in the universe most likely contains no inherent meaning and has no inherent biases. In fact, it appears that the only way information can be meaningful or useful is in relation to something else. That's neutrality. So if data is neutral, then unfortunately I won't be able to extract any relationships meant to help me achieve my goals from the clump or from my environment or from the universe. Even if a relationship like that does exist somewhere out there in the ether, I have no good way to access it. Okay, fine. Maybe I can't perform any extraction, but I've still got to determine that relationship somehow, or else I'm stuck. Without it, I can't do anything that might help me survive in my current situation. This leaves me with only one other option. I have to create the relationship myself. Maybe I could invent a new relationship from scratch. For example, I could try doing different things, seeing how the clump reacts, and then come up with the relationship from there. Or maybe I could use a relationship that I created in the past. For example, there could somehow be a system or mechanism built onto my body which has already determined the relationship beforehand. Either way, after I craft that relationship or use one which I crafted before, I can finally decide how to deal with this clump of stuff. Well, that independently crafted relationship is essentially what a value is. Autonomous relational interpretation of sensory information by a subjective observer is just a technical way of defining it. Autonomous, meaning independent or in a self-generated manner. Relational, meaning having to do with relationships or relationship-based. And interpretation, which is just defining or understanding something from your own perspective. To put it another way, value is the most basic mechanism or apparatus that lets an organism know which data is important, i.e. how sensory info relates to its goals, so the organism can then take appropriate action which is meant to help the organism achieve its goals. However, there are two extremely important facts here that must be noted. 1. If values are made and used by subjective entities for subjective purposes, then values themselves must also be subjective. 2. If all creatures must determine when and how to act on information, and if those determinations cannot be made through information alone, then all organisms, not just organisms with brains, will need to create and use values so they can react appropriately to the data they sense. It might be weird to think of creatures without brains, like viruses and bacteria, as using values, but if the premises up to now have been true, then they must be doing so. Therefore, if creatures without brains create and use values, then we should hypothetically be able to observe that process. And by observing that process, it might actually help us understand the function of the brain. So that'll be the topic for Chapter 2, how organisms without brains hypothetically use value. Chapter 2, how organisms without brains hypothetically use value. In the last chapter, I explained what value is, that it must be created, and that it's something all living beings, including ones without brains or nervous systems, should have to use. And if organisms without brains or nervous systems are creating and using values, then we should be able to observe them doing that. Of course, this all seems well and good. There's just one problem. Millions of species of organisms without brains currently exist in the world, and they each come equipped with their own unique collection of habits, characteristics, and structural features. These creatures are so diverse that it would probably be immensely difficult to find some characteristic or set of traits that all of them share. So how exactly do we observe the process of value creation or value use in these organisms? Einstein claimed that no problem can be solved from the same level of thinking that created it. Well, there's a similar concept that I've often found helpful. Generally speaking, when working on a problem, if you want to reduce your work, you must reduce the problem. Basically, if we want to figure out how organisms without brains create and use value, we need to reduce value use or value creation to its purest or simplest format. In other words, we must predict the most basic types of value use or value creation that could hypothetically exist. Then all we need to do is examine real creatures to see if their traits and behaviors line up with our prediction. And since organisms must create values before they can use them, we'll start by looking for the most basic types of value creation. Now we know from the last chapter there are two things that organisms would hypothetically need to create value: sensory info and a goal. So let's start with the goal part. It's most likely the case that all organisms are born with goals, survival and reproduction, as part of their body, behavior, or functioning, even if they're never aware of it. We could argue forever about where these goals originate from, and the truth is we may never know. But one thing we do know is that if organisms didn't accomplish these goals, life wouldn't be possible. I wouldn't be here today if most of my ancestors hadn't tried to keep themselves alive and or keep humanity going by having children. The same goes for every other species. Where exactly are these goals located? Well, that's a more complicated subject, one which I'll address in Chapter 6, Note 2. Therefore, if all creatures that we know of are essentially born with their goals built in, then the only other thing needed for value creation is sensory info. However, sensory info isn't really just one thing. There's an extremely wide array of information in the universe that organisms are capable of sensing, and oftentimes, different species don't even detect the same types of information. Okay, so if basically every organism senses different things, and if values are based on what organisms sense, then every organism is going to be creating different values, right? So how are we supposed to figure out the most basic types of value creation when that's the case? It's a difficult question, but maybe in this circumstance, it's not about the what. If we can't figure out the simplest types of value creation by looking at what creatures sense, then maybe we need to look at when creatures sense things. But organisms could sense information at any point in their lives, couldn't they? So how will that help us? Well, yes, the exact moment when organisms detect information is going to change constantly, and will be different for every creature. But if we assume that info detection and value creation are separate procedures that can occur at different times, then it's possible these two procedures could happen in different orders. In other words, organisms could A. determine values before sensing info, also known as predetermining value, or B. determine values after sensing info, also known as assigning value. So if these two value creation points are different in terms of when they happen, maybe they're also different in terms of how they happen or how organisms perform them, which means predetermination and assignment could be the two most basic types of value creation. Alright, cool. Now that we have two contenders for the simplest types of value creation, we need to look at how these two strategies might work. We'll start with predetermination, since we kind of have to for this book to make sense. If predetermination is a real strategy that happens, how would it occur? Obviously, the idea of predetermination isn't hard to understand. It just means applying value to something before you sense it. But how would that actually work in the real world? And more importantly, how could organisms predetermine values in a way that allows them to survive and reproduce? This is where we run into a slight obstacle, a predicament, if you will. Let's say you're a predetermining creature, and you've got a tiny bit of data that you want to determine the value of. We'll call it data X. Well, if you've never come across data X before, how would it be possible to know its value? How exactly are you supposed to figure out the relationship between X and your goals when you've never encountered X in your life? It would be pretty hard. But let's just say, for the sake of the example, that you choose some random value for X. In that case, it'll probably be impossible to know if that value is accurate. Karat section 2.1. What is an accurate value? An accurate value is a value which, relatively speaking, matches what can be measured or consistently experienced. Say I have a value that tells me that K is food. If I can't actually eat K and obtain energy from it, then my value would be inaccurate. Of course, I argued in Chapter 1 that all values are subjective. However, if it's true that information in the universe has some consistency in how we experience it, consistency that an individual can often act on, and if it's true that values are generally based on that apparent consistency, then we should usually be able to determine the accuracy of values, at least from the standpoint of our own experience. These same consistencies might also sometimes allow us to draw conclusions about the accuracy of others' values, as well as our own. This conversation goes a lot further, of course. For instance, there are more questions I could ask, like, how do I know other people aren't lying about their experiences? And how do I know if the things I'm experiencing aren't hallucinations of some sort? These can clearly be difficult questions to answer. However, if I suspect that something is a lie or hallucination, I can still look at separate parts of my experience to see if they match up. For example, if it seems like there's a giant bug attacking me while I'm laying in bed, I can look around for evidence that the bug is real. Is there a broken window or a hole in the wall where the bug entered the room? Are the bug's actions affecting its environment? Is the bug knocking over lampposts, swiping objects to the side, and moving carpet? Or is everything staying still? Do my actions affect the bug? If I throw something at the bug, does it bounce off? Also, if I suspect someone of lying, I can sometimes check for evidence of the lie. If my friend says that they were at the East Valley Hospital last Saturday night, I could go to that hospital and ask if they have a record of my friend being there. What this all means is, these consistencies are still useful and reliable tools even when parts of our experience might be less trustworthy. In fact, some consistencies are so reliable that they allow us to create models of the universe, models which can predict things with high degrees of precision. And while nothing in the universe contains inherent or objective value, see Carat 1.3, socially speaking, it might sometimes be necessary or at least useful to treat some information, values, and ideas as objective, due to the above consistencies and due to the nature of social systems, such as language, which must be agreed on and used in a common manner in order to function. So basically, if you're trying to predetermine the value of data X, any value that you pick will essentially be a guess. To make the problem worse, there's an insane amount of information in our universe, and therefore most of the data you run into probably won't be X, which matters if you're trying to survive or reproduce. If data X is something your body needs for survival, you've got to be sure that when you act, the thing you're acting on is definitely X and not some other random bit of data out there. You also need to be sure that you're acting on X the right way, because if not, you won't be able to accomplish your goals. And unfortunately, when your values are a guess, any actions you take based on those values will also be a guess. So how can you, as a predetermining creature, deal with this predetermining predicament? How can you create accurate values for data X before sensing it? And how can you make sure that you're acting on the right info the right way? Well, the reality is, as long as predetermination is your main value creation strategy, your values will always be somewhat of a guess, which means it'll always be impossible to know with total certainty if you're acting on the right thing in the right manner. However, if you conveniently happen to have a unique sensory mechanism, so unique that the only thing this mechanism is capable of sensing in the entire universe is data X, then you might not need total certainty. With a unique sensory mechanism, it would be extremely easy to at least find the data you're looking for. And if you can find the right data, it should also be easy to predetermine the right value for that data. How? Well, remember, to create values you need sensory info and a goal, and you already have the goal part. But although you might not have sensory info right now, if you know exactly what info you're going to sense in the future, you'll have something to base your actions on, which gives you the two ingredients you need to create accurate values. It's still possible that your values will be inaccurate because as a predetermining creature, you're still relying on guesses to some degree. but a unique sensory mechanism will make it a lot more likely that you'll find the right stuff and create the right values. Of course, you won't be able to do things like see color or hear music or recognize complexity. If unique sensory mechanisms are your only way of interacting with the world, then the things you detect will probably have to be things which are essential to your survival or reproduction. Still, if you're in a predetermining predicament like the one we just talked about, unique sensory mechanisms, or USMs, are one way you could deal with that predicament. So as long as data X actually exists in your environment, and as long as you have an appropriate response ready to go, you'll be able to react the moment you detect something. Basically, by using a USM, you won't ever have to think or hesitate, because you already know what it is you're sensing, and you've already determined its value. Karat section 2.2, the definition of predetermination, and why predetermined values are fixed. In more precise terms, to predetermine value means to designate positive value for a stimulus before sensing that stimulus in a way that facilitates specialized action toward the stimulus based on the value designated. A value which has been predetermined can also be described as a fixed value because it doesn't change, and can't change, during the life of the organism using it, hypothetically. Why would a predetermined value be fixed? To answer this question, I have to explain something called the order of operations. Under this thesis, there are 6 broad operations that underlie all organism function. They are information detection, aka sensation, signal confirmation, aka identification, determination of value, determination of effective action, and decision-making. These operations will be discussed in great detail in chapters 4 and 5, but for now all you need to know is this. Under this book's hypothesis, all living entities must perform at least some of the 6 operations in some particular order to survive, reproduce, and/or pass on their genes. However, not all entities will have to perform the operations in the same order. Let's imagine that you can construct life, and let's say you want to make a creature whose values can change, i.e. a creature whose values aren't fixed. If you made a creature whose order of operations is sense information, determine the value of that info, determine an effective action, act, then that might work. In this case, value is being determined after info has been sensed, which means that value is going to depend on whatever information was sensed. That's how the operations would hypothetically work. Each operation should always depend on, and in some way be based on, the previous operation. Well, sensory info is something that can change from moment to moment. So when value is based on something that can change, then value itself should also be changeable. The problem is, a predetermining organism wouldn't work that way. If I'm right, the order of operations of a predetermining organism would be determine the value of information, determine an effective action for that info, sense information, potentially confirm the signal, act. Essentially, predetermining organisms base their values, sensory structures, and response mechanisms on future sensory data. You can think of that future sensory data as a prediction which never changes because info hasn't been sensed yet. So because these values are based on something that doesn't change, the values themselves should also be unchanging. Wait a minute, what would happen if a predetermining organism simply adjusted its values after sensing, confirming, or acting on info? In that case, it could change its own behaviors, and its values wouldn't have to be fixed. Problem solved, right? Well, yes, technically that would be true. There's just one issue. If an organism did that, if it sensed, confirmed, or acted on things and then adjusted its values afterward, it would no longer be a predetermining organism. By definition, such behavior would constitute value assignment, since the values of the system are now being determined after sensing info. Predetermining organisms must, by definition, construct values, along with the physical mechanisms used to act on those values, before sensing anything, to be considered predetermining organisms. As such, these kinds of values will necessarily be fixed. This basically means that predetermining systems should have consistent predictable responses to the info they detect, or in some cases, patterns of info. Predetermining creatures might sometimes carry multiple systems of response on their body, but the way each of those systems react to things should be extremely consistent, i.e. fixed. Of course, this setup has an unfortunate side effect. Because of the way they're built, predetermining systems will have no capacity for active error correction. If a predetermining creature acts on the wrong target or acts in a manner that's ineffective, there will be no way for it to correct those mistakes, because its systems of response are pre-built and locked in place in terms of how they react to info. Genetic changes and/or physical damage could alter the values or sensory systems or behavior patterns of these creatures, but such alterations won't stem from any intentionality on the part of the organism. Other questions about the order of operations will be addressed in chapters 4 and 5. Also, I realize that even after this whole explanation, the idea that all predetermining systems are fixed might still seem improbable to some people. But as we'll get into, this is most likely how it works. TLDR, a predetermined value is a fixed value, and this Karat section is way too long. At this point you might be thinking, this is all way too convenient. There's no way a creature could just be born with a mechanism which detects the exact right information it needs to survive or reproduce. Except that's precisely what we can see happening in certain organisms. In fact, there's a whole bunch of creatures that use what could be considered USMs to interact with the world, and they all just happen to be organisms without brains. Take for example the HIV virus. Basically, the virus has tiny proteins which function as sensors covering its body that are only capable of detecting certain types of cells, immune cells with a CD4 receptor on their surface. See source number 1 in the video's description. Because of this, HIV cannot infect many organisms. It can only bind to and infect specific cells with specific characteristics. When HIV detects one of those cells, it immediately attempts infection. It doesn't think about whether or not to act, it just carries out an automatic and specialized response whenever it senses something, almost like that response was preset before any info was detected. Or take the neutrophil, the most common type of white blood cell in the human immune system. Like many other immune cells, neutrophils are responsible for killing infections and controlling inflammation in the body. But in order to find infection and inflammation, they must use a process called chemotaxis. See source 2 in description. How does chemotaxis work? Well, basically neutrophils have receptors on their body called chemoreceptors, which only bind to specific chemicals. When these receptors bind to a chemical, the neutrophil starts moving to where the chemical is most concentrated, which allows them to locate their targets with relative ease. Unlike HIV viruses, neutrophils can have a wide variety of different chemoreceptors, and each receptor may sense a different substance. However, when a neutrophil detects one of these substances, it has a consistent and predictable reaction. It starts migrating towards the source of the chemical. If you wanted to, you could label each chemoreceptor as a separate, unique sensory mechanism, which would mean that neutrophils carry multiple unique sensory mechanisms on their body. But even though they have multiple chemoreceptors, each chemoreceptor still senses highly specific info, and the moment something is detected, the neutrophil has a highly specific response, suggesting that it might have predetermined the value of that sensory information. Karat section 2.3, more examples of predetermining mechanisms. Macrophages are a part of the human immune system that eliminate infections. However, in order to find infectious agents, macrophages have evolved a restricted number of phagocytic receptors. These receptors are capable of binding only to certain proteins, called motifs, that exist on certain pathogens. See source 3. And once they bind to a pathogen, macrophages are built to respond in a highly specific manner, attempting to eat the pathogen. The bacteria Akkermansia muciniphila, which resides in the intestines, survives by consuming mucin, the primary protein component of mucus. See source 4. Because A. muciniphila carries mechanisms which are designed to detect specific information, aka mucin, and then perform a specific action with that information, it would suggest that a USM or multiple may be involved in this process. E. coli is an organism that uses chemoreceptors/chemotaxis to move towards environments of infection. See source 5. Except E. coli doesn't fight infection, it is the infection. Some organisms, such as plants and algae, don't carry out any explicit outward actions to accomplish their biological goals. However, these organisms still seem to use specialized and pre-built mechanisms to function. For instance, in order to obtain energy, plants and algae use chloroplasts, which are made specifically to absorb light particles and convert those particles into energy. See source 6. While chloroplasts might not normally appear to be USMs, the important thing to note is that, just like all USMs, chloroplasts can only detect highly specific information and perform highly specific actions with that info. Paramecium caudatum is a single-celled freshwater organism known as a ciliate. To defend itself, it uses needle-like stingers known as trichocysts. These trichocysts are expelled from the body when paramecium detects highly specific environmental triggers, such as the presence of calcium ions. See Source 7. Asbestopluma hypogea is a carnivorous sponge that feeds on other creatures. To capture prey, it uses hook-like filaments covering its body. These filaments can latch onto a wide variety of things, but when something gets caught in them, the sponge always has the same reaction. Sponge cells migrate towards the prey and concentrate around it, at which point the digestion process starts. See Source 8. If you're thinking, that doesn't sound like a unique sensory mechanism, it's okay, we'll talk more about this sponge in a second. Of course, HIV and neutrophils, as well as all the examples in the above Karat section, are more complicated when studied in detail, and carry other anatomical, genetic, and molecular systems on or in their body. However, most of them do seem to use what could be described as unique sensory mechanisms to detect info in the world. But the truth is, unique sensory mechanisms are not the only kind of mechanisms a creature could use to solve the predetermining predicament. If you read Karat section 2.3, you may have noticed there was one example that stood out, the carnivorous sponge. Basically, the carnivorous sponge's body is covered with hook-like filaments, which the sponge uses to catch and consume prey. These hooks, which also function as sensory mechanisms, are able to catch many different things. They don't exactly discriminate. In this case, we can see that the sponge's sensory system doesn't detect highly specific and unique information, but instead detects a more broad type of data, physical touch and disturbance, which means we can't really label this as a unique sensory mechanism. But what is it? Well, there's one very important thing to note about this particular setup. When an organism, such as the carnivorous sponge, has a sensory system that detects a broad type of data, as long as no nervous system is present, the organism tends to use the same response, or sequence of responses, for all info it detects. For example, when the sponge catches something with its hooks, the sponge's cells react by surrounding whatever was caught, then attempting to digest it. See Source 8. This happens no matter what the hooks catch, meaning the sponge is using the same response for everything the hooks detect. So while the sponge may not sense unique or specific data, the sponge still basically treats all sensory data as if it has a specific value, food. And since the sponge also acts as soon as it detects something, it looks as if the value of that sensory data might have been predetermined. Still, we can't exactly call these hooks unique sensory mechanisms due to how they function. If we want a better term to describe them, we could call them generic response mechanisms, or GRMs, since the sponge uses the same generic response, or set of responses, for all information the hooks sense. But why would GRMs work? Why would a creature with a GRM actually be able to survive or reproduce? Well, in the case of the sponge, it all comes down to the response systems, i.e. digestive systems, the sponge carries. Even if an organism detects extremely broad information, as long as the creature has response systems which are able to handle most of the things it detects, and as long as the creature is able to meet its basic needs through this process enough of the time, GRMs could hypothetically be just as useful as USMs. Karat section 2.4. Some organisms also concentrate on specific goals. It also probably helps that some creatures only need to concentrate on specific biological goals. For instance, some creatures can reproduce by themselves, asexually. They don't need to find a mate. So since the reproduction side of things is already taken care of, so to speak, these creatures will be free to concentrate on finding energy sources/eating. I probably don't need to mention it, but I don't think this type of concentration is a conscious thing. Other organisms, such as certain viruses, don't really need to survive in the traditional sense of the word, because they're not exactly alive. However, viruses still need to reproduce in order to spread, and most viruses can't reproduce asexually. As a result, most of the sensory mechanisms and anatomical structures these viruses carry will probably be built to support some part of the reproductive process. In other words, since these viruses don't need to worry about survival, they can spend most of their time/energy concentrating on reproduction. The point is, if GRMs are your main way of interacting with the world, it would probably help if you only had to focus on one goal at a time. Of course, this may not be happening in all cases, but I figured I'd mention this possibility. This means both unique sensory mechanisms and generic response mechanisms could be viable ways for an organism to predetermine value. Both USMs and GRMs are built so that the creature using them has a seemingly preset reaction to sensory data. Also, these sorts of mechanisms appear to be the primary way that organisms without nervous systems detect and respond to info in the world. Yes, some organisms might have multiple predetermining sensory mechanisms on their body, maybe even mechanisms which work in separate ways. The Salmonella virus, for example, has multiple systems for invading and infecting eukaryotic cells. See source 9. But even still, it appears that predetermination may indeed be happening in organisms without brains. And not just that, but it might be the main strategy by which these organisms create and use value. Karat section 2.5. The behavior of creatures with GRMs and USMs can be more complex. There seem to be cases where GRMs can have different reactions to different sequences or patterns of information. For example, Spirostomum ambiguum, which is a single-celled protozoan, will contract its body, effectively making itself smaller in response to mechanical vibrations and/or electrical changes in the surrounding water. Since these physical vibrations could be considered a broad type of sensory info, this system could be classified as a GRM. However, when these mechanical vibrations keep occurring, the probability of this contractile behavior decreases. See source 10. In other words, the organism is acting differently depending on the frequency of the sensory stimulus, which is also known as habituation. There could be several reasons for such habituation, reasons which probably vary depending on the creature. But regardless of the reasons, we can still clearly see certain predetermining traits in the organisms that do this. These creatures still don't identify what they're acting on. The actions they take, if any, are still taken the moment info is detected, and their actions/reactions are still highly predictable overall. And although creatures with GRMs can sometimes exhibit these habituated responses, because they don't identify what they're acting on, it's still not possible for them to learn in a highly dynamic manner the way nervous systems do. Also, there are cases where creatures with USMs can have more complex responses to sensory signals. For instance, when neutrophils detect multiple chemical signals, they must have a way to determine which chemical signal to act on, which is done hierarchically. See source 11. However, none of this behavior appears to contradict the primary thesis, as neutrophils still behave in an immediate and seemingly preset manner. But why does all this matter? Well, it matters for one simple reason. If we know, or have hypothesized, how organisms without brains use value, and if we know that organisms with brains behave differently from creatures without brains, then maybe the difference between these systems stems from a difference in how value is used. Chapter 3. How organisms with brains hypothetically use value. In Chapter 2, I discussed two basic strategies of creating value: predetermination and assignment. I also explained how organisms without brains might be predetermining values by using certain kinds of sensory mechanisms, unique sensory mechanisms, or USMs, and generic response mechanisms, or GRMs. But what does all this have to do with the brain? To answer that, we need to look at what predetermining systems can't do, i.e. how they're limited. See, USMs can only detect small amounts of highly specific info. This means that USMs will always have a highly limited sensory capacity. Of course, this limitation is what allows them to function. If you're a creature that can only detect very specific items in the world, then whenever your sensors detect something, the info you're sensing is statistically likely to be the items that you're looking for. As a result, you can basically assume the identity of any sensory data that you come across, and thus you can also assume how that data is related to you and your goals, aka its value. Creatures with GRMs can detect non-specific info, aka broad types of info, but the creatures using GRMs don't really identify the things they act on, and will generally treat all sensory data in the same ways, with a few exceptions. In other words, GRMs will always have a highly limited ability to discriminate between the various objects, creatures, and bits of info they sense. Again, this limitation is part of how they work. If you can't identify anything, then one way you can accomplish your goals is to just apply the same values to all sensory data. So instead of assuming the identity of the stuff you're sensing, you're basically assuming the relationship that stuff has to you and your goals, which allows you to use the same set of responses on everything you detect. And as long as this strategy pays off enough of the time, as long as you have response systems which can handle most of the things you detect, you won't really have to identify what you're acting on. But what if you wanted a large sensory capacity and the ability to discriminate, i.e. a sensory system which could detect large amounts of specific info while being able to tell the difference between things? In that case, you couldn't use USMs or GRMs because neither of them are set up for that. It's possible for a creature to carry multiple USMs and/or GRMs, but unless these mechanisms were somehow tied together, it still won't achieve that result. Because as long as each mechanism is still predetermining values, each mechanism should still have and rely on the limitations I just described. And even if your mechanisms were tied together, if the information you're sensing is diverse enough, you'll need some way to integrate or calculate the different signals coming from your USMs and GRMs. And unfortunately, USMs and GRMs by themselves can't calculate anything. This means, in order to have a large sensory capacity and ability to discriminate, you'll most likely need a new type of system. The problem is, that new system won't be able to utilize predetermination, and there are two reasons why. Number one, when you can sense large amounts of info and discriminate between things, it becomes impossible to assume the identity of what you detect like USMs do. The only reason why USMs could get away with assuming the identity of things is because they sense such tiny amounts of data overall. But when you can sense wide varieties of info, that identity assumption is no longer viable. And since the values of these predetermining systems are based on identity assumptions, it means these new systems won't be able to create value the same way. Number two, when you have a high-capacity discriminatory system, you can't really apply the same values to everything you detect, like organisms with GRMs. The whole reason why a creature with a GRM would hypothetically apply the same value to most, if not all, sensory info is because it can't discriminate between the various things it's sensing. But if you have the ability to discriminate, and you can sense lots of stuff, you're inevitably going to be much more aware of your surroundings. Some things might be necessary for you to act on, like a tasty fish, but other things might not be, like a motionless rock. With a greater ability to discriminate comes a weaker ability to generalize. At some point, it will simply be impossible to apply the same values to all info you sense, because you can directly observe that different things have different relationships to you and your goals. You could still use the same responses on everything you detect, but there'd be no reason to do that, since different things have different values. Karat section 3.1. Where would high-capacity discriminatory systems originate? How would a sensory system like this evolve in the first place? It may have to do with generic response mechanisms. Unlike USMs, GRMs are built to respond to broad types of info. We also know from Karat section 2.5 that some creatures with GRMs have evolved the ability to perform habituated actions, meaning that the same sensory stimulus will invoke a different response depending on how often that stimulus occurs. Well, one could argue that a habituated response is a certain type of discrimination. By treating different frequencies of stimulation in different ways, the organism may be assuming that different frequencies have different values. It could also mean that the creature's response mechanisms simply don't have enough energy to take the same action repeatedly. In any case, if it's at least possible for some form of differentiation to occur in an otherwise non-differentiating system, then it may also be possible that, at some point, creatures with GRMs simply developed more distinct or granular mechanisms for differentiation. Jellyfish stingers might be an example of this. The stingers that jellyfish use, or cnidocytes, have hair-like sensors on their exterior surface which detect information. These sensors, in nearly every way, work like a GRM. When something touches the hairs, the stinger generally fires. Now these hairs will typically respond to any physical disturbance, so it's probably safe to assume that the stinger is not identifying or discriminating between most things it acts on. However, unlike many other GRMs, a jellyfish stinger can be dangerous to its host. If a jellyfish can't tell the difference between its own body and other objects, the jellyfish might end up stinging itself quite a bit. So apart from sensing physical touch, some cnidocytes have evolved the ability to detect chemical signals using chemoreceptors. These chemoreceptors will essentially prime or diffuse the stinger, so that the likelihood of firing either increases or decreases. Basically, when these chemoreceptors detect chemicals coming from prey, the cnidocyte becomes primed, and when they don't detect these chemicals, the stinger will be diffused. See source 12 in description. This is how a jellyfish is able to keep from stinging itself, even though its stingers are like GRMs in how they function. Hypothetically, we could look at cnidocytes as a special kind of sensory unit which combines the functions of USMs and GRMs into a single mechanism, thereby sensing both specific types of information and broad types of information at the same time. I don't have a good name for this third type of sensory mechanism. Maybe you could call it a Specialized Generic Response Mechanism, or SGRM. These stingers, or mechanisms like them, could have been where high-capacity, high-discrimination sensory systems initially evolved from, or could be related to the use of such systems, since these stingers have a larger and more diverse sensory capacity than a standard USM or GRM. It could also be the case that high-capacity discriminatory systems come about when an organism needs to mediate between multiple information sources, or regulate the behavior of multiple sensory mechanisms at the same time. So if your high-capacity, high-discrimination sensory system can't predetermine values, and if values are required for all organisms to operate, then in order to use this new system, you'll need to come up with a different value creation strategy. And if what I discussed in the last chapter is correct, there's really only one other strategy you can utilize: value assignment. Okay then, let's just suppose for a moment that value assignment is a real thing happening in some organisms. How would it work? What are the most basic traits that a value assigning system or creature would have? Sure, it's possible that a value assigning system might have a high sensory capacity and ability to discriminate, but that doesn't actually tell us anything about how that system would function. There's one thing we can conclude though. Predetermining organisms don't really have to do much to create values, because their values are basically created and set in stone at birth, or before any info is sensed. But assigning creatures would probably be different. Assigning organisms determine values after sensing info, which means their values will have to adapt to the current situation or environment in some way. As a result, assigning creatures will need to take some kind of action or carry some kind of system whose purpose is to actively create new values. But how would that system work? What structures, behaviors, or characteristics would that system have? And what traits would we see in the creatures using such a system? Let's start with what we already know about value. My hypothesis states that fundamentally a value is a relationship. Well, in order to have a relationship, you need at least two separate things to come together and form some kind of connection. So the first thing we might see in a value assigning system is a way of creating and maintaining connections of some sort, maybe even multiple connections at once. How would those connections take place though? What things would be getting connected? Potentially, one way these connections could work is by taking separate sensory units and creating some kind of association between those units. For instance, let's say that data Y is a creature that's a threat to you, like a predatory animal. In order to assign value to data Y, you could take the sensory units which detect data Y and associate them with some other sensory signal that indicates danger. We can call the danger signal data R. By associating Y with R, you get a specific value, value Z. Remember, value is not the sensory signal itself, value is the relationship between the two signals. Hypothetically, this value association would tell you, in a crude manner, how Y is related to you and your goals, and as a result, you'll have a rough idea of what to do about Y, or a basis for your actions. Depending on the situation, value Z may even enable you to survive, or at least act in a manner that promotes your survival. Carat section 3.2, the definition of assignment. In technical terms, to assign value is to designate positive value for a stimulus after sensing that stimulus in a way that would facilitate specialized action toward the stimulus based on the value designated. An assigned value can be described as a conditional or modifiable value, because this type of value is capable of being modified and is also dependent on the sensory conditions, i.e. the specific stimulus or combination of stimuli, which are present when it's formed. And even if an assigned value never is modified or adjusted after creation, even if this value is passed down to later generations via genetic systems, as long as it can be modified in a direct and active manner, then it can still be considered an assignment type value. Also, the above definition says would facilitate because, unlike most predetermining mechanisms, it's possible, or at least it should be possible, for a value assigning organism not to take action on something it's currently sensing. And the reason has to do with sensory capacity. When a creature is capable of sensing large enough amounts of info, but only has a limited amount of energy to spend, that creature won't be able to act on everything it detects. As a result, a creature like this must have the ability not to act on some information or values. If an assigning organism has a high enough sensory capacity, it may even need a way of choosing what information to act on, i.e. the ability to make decisions. But that topic will be discussed more later. Okay, so maybe a value assigning system would create values through connections, and maybe those connections would come in the form of associations between sensory units. But that still doesn't tell us a whole lot. At the very least, there are other questions we could ask to get a better picture of how this association system works. For example, would these associations be permanent? Because if so, your value assigning system won't be very versatile. If y is permanently attached to r, then value z will be unchangeable, and if that connection was made by mistake, or if y's relationship to you changes, you won't be able to do anything about that. So one of the basic characteristics we might see in a real-life value association system is the ability for associations to be modified. 2. Would these associations be instant? Because that could also be a problem. If you're dealing with enough sensory data that you're frequently encountering new stuff or new combinations of stuff, you may not always be able to determine the value of things right away. In some cases, you might need a bit of time to figure out how info is related to you or your goals, if at all. However, if your value associations are made the instant you sense something, there's a good chance your values will often be inaccurate. See Carat 2.1 for the definition of value accuracy. So on top of modifying associations, you may also want the ability to increase or decrease the strength of your associations, aka the ability to grade associations, as time passes and more info comes in. 3. Would you be able to remember your associations? Because if not, you'll constantly have to create new values, and all the values you do create will basically be one-time use, making it impossible for you to learn anything. So another quality or trait we might see in a value assigning system is some mechanism or structure, or maybe even multiple mechanisms or structures that enable memory. Those mechanisms might be different depending on the species and depending on the scale you're looking at. But in any case, if your values aren't set in stone, then some type of memory would probably be good to have. 4. Would all your associations be direct connections? Because that might not be ideal. Let's say you want to create an association between sensory unit A and sensory unit B, but the only way to create that association is by using some kind of string which goes directly from A to B. Maybe the string can work in some cases, but what if A's relationship to you changes? What if you find out that A actually needs to be attached to sensory unit C? Now you'll need to create a new string between A and C, or cut the first string and reattach it to C. This sounds like it would be pretty easy to do, except in an actual organism, this way of doing things would be highly inefficient. If you have to create a direct connection between every sensory unit you associate, not only will you be using up significant amounts of energy to do this, especially if you need to create lots of values, but this process will most likely be slow as well, especially if your sensory units are located far apart from each other. In an environment where anything can change at a moment's notice, it'd be much better to have a system that can form and modify values quickly. But in order to do that, you'll need a slightly different approach. Maybe instead of direct connections, you could have a system where each sensory unit on your body has a representative, kind of like a friend or family member who takes actions and makes decisions on your behalf. Basically, instead of forming associations directly between sensory units, this system could often form associations between representatives. These representatives could even be bundled together so that associations can be formed or changed more quickly. Lastly, how would your motor and response mechanisms work with a system like this? Remember, when you have a high sensory capacity and an ability to discriminate, it doesn't make sense to treat everything the same way, because different things are going to have different values. But this creates an issue. Most predetermining organisms are only built to perform a limited number of actions. If you look at any organism using a USM or GRM, the total amount of things that these creatures can do is always small or highly limited. The HIV virus, for example, only has the ability to attempt infection. It can't walk, it can't swim, it can't bite or grab. All it can do is detect a specific kind of protein on a specific kind of cell. And once it detects that protein, it can attempt to place its own RNA into that cell, i.e. infection. Why are predetermining creatures like this? Well, presumably, it's because each predetermining organism only deals with a small range of values in general. And since actions under this thesis are usually based on values, the physical structures/mechanisms predetermining creatures use to carry out actions will only need to be built to do a small number of things. But when you have a high sensory capacity and can tell the difference between things, the amount of values you may have to create could be very large. If your systems of response are only able to perform a small number of actions, those systems won't be of any help when you run across something they aren't made for. So ultimately, if you have a sensory system which is wide-ranging in terms of what it can detect and what values it can create, you may also need motor or response systems which are more wide-ranging in what they can do. For example, rather than being able to eat one thing, it might be necessary for a value-assigning organism to be able to eat a whole myriad of things, and to have digestive systems which allow this. Or maybe, rather than having motor systems capable of one single direction movement, like swimming forward, it might be better for a value-assigning creature to have motor systems capable of several types of movement. And rather than having appendages meant for one kind of task, like infection, it might be better to have appendages like hands or tentacles capable of performing a variety of tasks. These broad-functioning motor and response systems wouldn't just allow organisms to handle a larger variety of situations, environments, and values, but they'd also make it easier for creatures to adjust their behavior when environments, situations, and values change. So if value assignment is occurring in real creatures, these are just some of the basic traits we might see. However, just because the above traits might sometimes be advantageous, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'd occur in all value assigning systems at all times. In fact, there could be situations where assigning organisms are better off without some of the above characteristics. For example, certain value associations could be more effective if they were essentially instantaneous and permanent, because it would allow the organism to have quick reflexive reactions to specific kinds of sensory information. Or there could be cases where value-assigning creatures use specialized motor and response systems rather than broad-functioning ones, because it might be necessary for dealing with specific entities, info, and circumstances the organism frequently encounters. There may also be cases where the association mechanisms are not bundled together but are instead scattered or dispersed, sort of like a net of sensory units. Still, it's probably no coincidence that the above traits look very much like the traits of nervous systems, brains, and the organisms which carry them. Not only do nervous systems have a higher sensory capacity and ability to discriminate than predetermining organisms, but nervous systems also often carry the above traits: the ability to form associations, the ability to modify and change the strength of associations, representative sensory units, and some kind of memory. It's also probably no coincidence that organisms with nervous systems typically have more wide-ranging motor and response systems, such as legs, arms, or tentacles, capable of performing a broader set of tasks and allowing the organism to move and behave in a larger variety of ways. So how much sensory information or discrimination ability would an organism need in order for a value-assigning system to appear? Well, the truth is, it's hard to say. In Karat section 3.1, we talked about how jellyfish stingers, or cnidocytes, are a special kind of sensory mechanism which can sense both broad and specific information at the same time. But unfortunately, not all cnidocytes are attached directly to a neural structure. However, interestingly enough, the organisms which carry cnidocytes always have a nervous system of some sort, a nervous system which often works in conjunction with these specialized cells. See source 13. So what? This could all just be a coincidence. Well, here's the thing. We know from Chapter 1 that all organisms must use value in some capacity, and therefore, all creatures must have some system or mechanism which enables the use of value. In predetermining creatures, those mechanisms are relatively straightforward, but creatures with a high enough sensory capacity and the ability to discriminate wouldn't logically be able to use predetermination, as I explained at the beginning of this chapter. So if these kinds of creatures can't predetermine values, then by this book's argument, they must be creating values after sensing information, aka assigning values. Which means there must be some system or mechanisms these kinds of creatures carry which enables them to assign values. Since brains and nervous systems only appear in organisms with higher sensory capacities and the ability to discriminate, and since nervous systems always regulate, mediate, or modify the behavior of organisms after sensing information, It would strongly suggest that nervous systems are, in fact, enabling the process of value assignment. When you combine this with the various traits of neurons, the ability to form associations, the ability to change the strength of associations, representative sensory units, and memory, it paints what I believe to be a compelling picture that nervous systems are indeed that system which performs the function of creating and modifying values. If nervous systems were not assigning values, then under this book's argument, there would have to be some other system or mechanism which was playing that role. And there's simply no other likely candidate. Karat section 3.3. What if a neuron is a predetermining mechanism? Is it possible that a single neuron by itself could actually be considered a predetermining mechanism? It's a good question. In the last chapter, I hypothesized that predetermining systems often sense unique information and are essentially fixed in how they respond to that information. Well, if we observe the behavior and traits of a single neuron, that's kind of what we see. On one hand, neurons themselves can be pretty diverse. Some neurons pass information via chemical messengers. Other neurons are quite literally fused together and communicate through direct electrical signals. Some neurons can send electrical signals down their axon, but other neurons have no axon at all. And the smaller mechanisms which support this functioning only add to the complexity. Depending on the species you're observing, neurons might behave in strange or unexpected manners or have unusual traits. But generally, it is possible for a neuron to be electrically charged or excited by highly specific info in the world. For example, the neurons in your ear which enable hearing are often attached to sensory hairs, which vibrate in response to specific frequencies of sound. Plus, when a neuron becomes excited or charged, there are highly specific and predictable ways in which that neuron will behave. Generally, when a neuron becomes excited, it sends electricity down its axon to endpoint dendrites, where chemical signals are passed to another neuron or group of neurons. As a result, you could look at a single neuron as a predetermining sensory mechanism, possibly. However, there are a couple factors which complicate this issue. A. Neurons generally have the capacity to inhibit and excite other neurons, and because of that, it's possible for neurons to be dynamically modified in how they respond to information. For instance, neuron A might react a certain way when presented with a specific stimulus, but if another neuron, neuron B, releases inhibitory signals to A, neuron A's reaction, or reaction pattern, can be altered. So even if A always senses the same kinds of things, the way it responds to that data can change over time, which is not something we generally see in other predetermining systems. Yes, according to Carat 2.5, creatures with GRMs can have varied reactions to the same information. But there's one big difference between neurons and organisms with GRMs, which is that GRMs cannot continually adapt to new information or new patterns of activation, whereas a neuron, because its behavior can be modified by other neurons, generally can. As such, it would be difficult to say that all neurons are fixed response systems. That is, unless you want to argue that the method by which action potentials propagate is what's fixed. B. Even if we accept that a single neuron is a predetermining mechanism, that wouldn't necessarily be true for sets of neurons, i.e. nervous systems, because generally, it's only when you combine the activity of neurons that's when you see all the traits we talked about above. Large sensory capacity, ability to create associations, ability to modify associations, etc. If values are relationships, it's likely that the process of value assignment will always require multiple independently functioning components. Therefore, it makes sense that value assignment wouldn't stem from the activity of one single neuron in isolation. If value assignment is indeed happening in the brain, we should see it happening primarily at a group level by way of multi-neuron activity. In summary, it's possible that a single neuron could, in some cases, be considered a predetermining mechanism. Of course, there's more to this conversation, which we'll go over in Chapter 6, Note 3. But ultimately, my argument is not that one neuron performs value assignment. My argument is that nervous systems perform value assignment. Okay, so maybe value is something all organisms have to create and use, and maybe brains and nervous systems perform the function of value assignment. But that doesn't mean value assignment is the main function of the brain. Well, yes, that's true. So far, I've only really argued that nervous systems perform value assignment, not that assignment is the brain's primary function. There could be some other operation or function which falls under the category of main function. It's also possible that the brain has no main function. So that's what the next chapter will deal with, and what this whole thesis has been leading up to. Why value assignment might potentially be the primary function of the brain. Chapter 4. Why value assignment may be the primary function of the brain. In the last 3 chapters, I laid out my argument for why value assignment could be a function that nervous systems, including the brain, perform. But one big question I haven't answered yet is, why would value assignment be the brain's primary function? Well, this is the chapter where I finally address that. Unfortunately, to answer that question, I need to explain something called the order of operations, which was mentioned in Karat 2.2. Now I have to warn you, most of Chapter 4 will be spent describing and explaining these order of operations. But if we want to see why value assignment may be the primary function of the brain, we need to look at the other major functions the brain may be performing, which means discussing the order of ops. It's gonna be a bit of a journey, but just like before, we'll take things one step at a time, and by the end of this chapter, it'll all make sense. So here we go. Let's start by talking about what these operations are. Under this book's hypothesis, there are 6 fundamental operations which all living creatures either can or will use to accomplish their biological goals. They are 1. Information detection aka sensation, universal. 2. Signal confirmation aka identification, non-universal. 3. Determination of value, universal. 4. Determination of effective action, universal. 5. Action, universal. 6. Decision-making, non-universal. These operations are what I call first-order functions, meaning that in every biological system, whether small or large, these operations should be the first priority. Biological systems, like the brain, might perform a whole range of different tasks, functions, and activities, but all observable tasks, functions, and activities should either exist underneath or be an extension of one of these 6 operations. 4 of the operations will be necessary for all organisms to carry out, making them universal operations, while 2 operations will only be used by some creatures some of the time, making them non-universal operations. Also, since these operations can't occur all at once, every creature will have to perform these operations in a particular order. However, not all organisms will have to perform the operations in the same order, necessarily. In fact, if I'm correct, the order of operation should be different for predetermining and assigning creatures. For predetermining creatures, the order of operation should be determine the value of some information, determine an effective action for that info, detect that info, potentially confirm the signal, action. For assigning creatures, the order of operation should be detect information, potentially confirm the signal, determine the value of that information, determine an effective action, potential decision, action. Karat section 4.1, more on what first-order function means. The concept of first-order functions has some considerable scientific implications, so let's talk about them. To start, when I call these operations first-order functions, I mean that these operations should be observable at the top of, i.e. governing, any biological activity loop at all scales of biological function. Basically, if something in the universe is trying to accomplish survival or reproduction, or trying to help a bigger organism survive/reproduce, a set of the above operations should be present somewhere in its behavior. For instance, when a virus acts on, i.e. tries to infect, a cell, because that action is directly meant to accomplish reproduction, a set of the above operations should have occurred prior to that action. The same is true when an ape walks. Because the movement of walking serves to support the ape's survival, observable in the ape's brain activity, we should see an order of operations uniting the various neural mechanisms which resulted in that overall motion. In other words, there should be a single top-level set of operations bringing many brain and anatomical systems together to produce the movement of walking. I understand that the idea of a single order of operations governing both extremely small and extremely large biological systems, including systems which are inordinately complex, may sound far-fetched. However, if we start from first principles, these operations, I believe, should intuitively emerge. If we accept that all organisms perform the goals of survival and/or reproduction, then we must accept that certain basic processes will always be necessary in the accomplishment of these goals, regardless of size or scale. The order of operations are meant to be a rough outline of those most basic processes. For instance, we know that all organisms, no matter what size, must take some kind of action in order to keep themselves and/or the species alive. Even organisms which passively wait for information to be fed to them, once the information does appear, the organism must do something with it, i.e. transform that information in some way, to meet its own needs. Which is why we can include action as a first-order function, used by all creatures and which exists in all order of operations. The same should be true for the other operations on the list, save the two which are non-universal. To survive or reproduce, all organisms must sense information. All organisms must determine effective actions. And, if what I argued in the last 3 chapters is correct, all organisms must determine values. To put it another way, it would be impossible for an organism not to do these things and still live in the world, at least for very long. Which means we must see these operations occurring in every biological system at some level. And if both single-celled creatures, such as viruses, and complex multi-celled animals, such as a giant monkey, can function as whole organisms with their own singular goal sets, then we should see whole operations occurring at both these scales, the small and the large. This means, within the thesis, single-celled and multicellular processes should involve an order of operations of some kind, as long as those multicellular processes serve, in tandem, to support the goals of a larger creature. How the order of operations actually appear or materialize, especially in complex systems, is another question entirely. But for now, this is the hypothesis. Moving on. Since neurons are technically cells, then all of this should apply to neural systems. In other words, an order of operations should be present at each scale of neural activity. The small scale, i.e. the behavior of a single neuron, the medium scale, an individual neural circuit, and the large scale, the unified activity of many neural systems, circuits, and actions. This would mean that in every brain, and likely every multicellular process, there are technically multiple order of operations occurring at the same time, as well as a top-level order of operations, which presumably governs the whole system. We'll discuss more about this in Chapter 6, Note 5, and Note 1. Also, the way operations are performed will likely change according to the scale on which they occur, i.e. how many distinct components are involved. For example, determination of value will probably work differently as a multicellular process than as a single-celled operation. Now, if you went down to the molecular level or the atomic level, an order of operations would not necessarily be present, because biological goals and actions are not taking place at those levels. Molecular and atomic activity must become organized for an organism to act on something or accomplish a goal. Furthermore, if you were to observe thousands or millions of cellular/neural actions, you may see other types of processes or functions occurring alongside the operations, things like memory and coordination. My speculation is that the purpose of such processes would be to support higher-level operation sets, although they may appear on their face as independent functions. Another thing, the operations themselves are meant to describe general classes or types of processes, rather than specific instances of behavior or activity, although in many cases these operations can encompass a single activity, behavior, or function. Lastly, the order of operations are not necessarily unbreakable laws. For example, it's hypothetically possible that in some situations, a creature can take action without sensing information first. It's also possible for the order of operations to be disrupted by disrupting the physical mechanisms through which they're carried out. But according to this thesis, every creature must be built to perform these operations in the aforementioned orders to consistently accomplish biological goals. Assuming the above two order of operations are accurate, there are a few things we can notice. First off, when comparing the two order of ops, we can see that some of the steps are switched around. In the predetermining order of ops, sensation and confirmation are the third and fourth steps. In the assigning order of ops, sensation and confirmation are the first and second steps. We can also see, in the assigning order of ops, that there's an extra step labeled potential decision. If the brain is indeed a value-assigning system, then the assigning order of ops is obviously the one we need to examine. Now before we move forward, there are a couple important details I need to clear up. When I use the term determination of value, I'm not necessarily talking about value assignment. Under this thesis, both predetermining and assigning organisms create values, which means that determination of value would be happening in both systems in some capacity. The difference is that predetermining creatures don't determine values actively. In other words, they don't spend energy on the value determination process while alive, whereas value assigning creatures do. So since value assignment is an active operation, we could say that value assignment is an actual function of the brain. Simply put, predetermination and value assignment are just different ways that determination of value can occur. But in this chapter, when I talk about the functions the brain may be performing, I'm talking about the active operations. Which operations are active? For predetermining creatures, there are only three: sensation, signal confirmation, and action. In value assigning creatures, all operations will hypothetically be active. Okay, now let's proceed. In the previous chapter, we discussed how value assignment might work. But what about the other 5 operations? What even are signal confirmation and determination of effective action anyway? And if all these operations are active in the brain, is it possible that one of them might be the brain's main function? Well, let's go over each one and find out. Starting with the first operation on the list, information detection aka sensation. Section 1. Information detection aka sensation. Sensation is the detection of information by an entity or sensory unit. Sensation is what enables any organism or independent being to interact with its surroundings, and is the main task that subjective observers accomplish. Also, to achieve sensation, you generally need some kind of device or apparatus which is capable of sensing things, i.e. a sensory mechanism. As the list of operations states, sensation is something that every creature must do. If organisms couldn't detect things around them, they'd have no way of responding or adapting to their environment, which means that life as we know it would not exist. It'd be pretty hard to argue that sensation is the main function of the brain, since all life forms in the universe, and possibly even non-life forms such as advanced AIs, would need to perform sensation in order to survive, reproduce, or work. But since we already know all this, let's move on to the next operation. Section 2. Signal confirmation aka identification. I'm defining signal confirmation as the process wherein an entity senses an object or unit of data, then uses some separate functionally unique mechanism to detect an additional element of that particular object or unit of data, in order to confirm the state or identity of the initial signal. So, what is this exactly, and why did I include it in the list of operations? Well, there's a reason this operation is also named identification. Let's say you're a single-celled organism and you've just sensed something. Now, being a creature this small, you don't really have a whole ton of energy to spend in general, so you probably don't want to waste your energy acting on whatever this thing is, unless you're sure it'll help you accomplish your goals in some way. Even if you have a unique sensory mechanism, it's still possible that your USM is somehow getting tricked or just having a bad day. So in this situation, it might be a good idea to have an extra mechanism or system on your body which can verify that this info is indeed what you're looking for, a mechanism which helps you identify the object you're currently sensing. Essentially, there are creatures in the world that may be doing this. HIV, for example, must bind to 2 separate receptor proteins in order to infect cells. See source 14 in description. Now it's possible that this secondary binding mechanism is simply a physical requirement for infection, but it's also possible that one of the reasons for this secondary binding is to confirm or verify that the thing HIV detected actually is a cell it can infect. Okay, even if signal confirmation is a real thing, how is it any different from information detection? Well, technically, all signal confirmation is a form of information detection, but not all information detection is signal confirmation. Here's the important difference. Info detection is an operation which can hypothetically occur by itself, without being connected to a separate structure or system. Some information detection systems, such as the camera on your phone, don't even need to be attached to a living creature in order to technically function. But that wouldn't be true for signal confirmation. In this thesis, signal confirmation cannot occur by itself. By definition, for confirmation to happen, there must be some other thing, i.e. some sensory info, that has already been detected beforehand, which means the mechanism or mechanisms that perform signal confirmation must always be connected to a separate thing. Also, the purpose of signal confirmation wouldn't just be to detect data, per se, but to make sure that a piece of data is what it seems to be. Now, if we were to take a more in-depth look at the various creatures mentioned in Chapter 2, we'd see that most of them don't seem to have any identification or signal confirmation systems, so we can probably conclude that signal confirmation isn't necessary for all organisms to perform. which is why I labeled it as a non-universal operation. Of course, it's also possible that signal confirmation is an operation no organisms perform. But if it is a real process, due to what it is, I don't believe it can exactly be classified as basic information detection. Why can't signal confirmation be the main function of the brain? Because brains probably don't perform it. If signal confirmation happens at all, it's most likely a small, aka predetermining, phenomenon. The only reason why a creature would ever have to perform confirmation is because it can't sense much info and must rely on some strange or unique system to help with identifying things. But since nervous systems have the capacity to sense much wider varieties of info, there should be no need for a separate identification process. In fact, the way brains and nervous systems would likely identify things is by using neural connections, which, if you read the last chapter, is how value assignment would hypothetically happen. Therefore, in the brain, value assignment would probably be replacing signal confirmation. Karat section 4.2. Is it possible that signal confirmation could replace value assignment? You might ask, what if neurons are mainly built for signal confirmation rather than value assignment? If identification occurs through neural connections, then isn't this possible? Here's the problem with that idea. Under this thesis, all biological systems must determine values in some way. If values are not employed at some point in an organism's cycle of functions, the organism hypothetically wouldn't be able to function at all. This means confirmation can't replace value assignment without rendering the system inert. Also, if confirmation is replacing assignment, then the whole idea this book is founded on would be completely bogus, which is indeed a possibility. However, I believe it's most likely the case that nervous systems simply don't use signal confirmation. The only reason I included signal confirmation in the value assigning order of ops is because it's hypothetically possible, in some alternate universe or unknown case, for an assigning creature to use this operation. But in our universe, it appears assigning organisms don't do that. Section 3. Determination of effective action. Determination of effective action is another universal operation, which means all organisms will have to perform it in some way, even if it doesn't always occur actively or consciously. But what exactly is effective action? I define it as action that an entity would take to achieve or bring itself closer to its goals. Now, there are 4 important points to make about effective action before moving forward. The first thing to mention is, when I use the term goals in the above definition, I'm not just talking about biological goals, although biological goals can be a part of it. In this definition, the term goals can also apply to smaller, less important, or more arbitrary goals that an entity might have. Number 2. In life, there are usually better ways and worse ways of achieving goals. For example, if you're playing chess, there are almost always going to be better moves you can make and worse moves you can make. And sometimes you're not even going to know which moves are better and which are worse. But effective action does not mean the best possible action you can take to achieve a particular goal. Effective action simply means the action that you've determined is the best, based on your position and understanding or perspective. The third thing to mention is that effective action can exist without any action happening. Effective action is simply the action you would take in order to achieve a goal. Let's say you're playing a game of basketball and your teammate just passed you the ball. You quickly scan your surroundings and you judge that your best move is to take the shot in place. But before you start to shoot, a blocker steals the ball. In that situation, you didn't actually take the shot you wanted. But since you would have taken that shot to reach your goal, it means you still determined the effective action, at least in this scenario. Some of you might be thinking, that sounds an awful lot like decision making. Don't worry, we'll discuss that in Chapter 6. Number 4, to execute an effective action, you must have some physical system or body part which is capable of carrying out the effective action. And not only that, but the way that system or body part works, moves, or is built should depend on what the effective action is. So why can't determination of effective action be the main function of the brain? Because it relies too much on value. To formulate effective action, you need something to act on, aka sensory info, and a goal or goals to act toward. Then you must figure out the relationship between that sensory info and those goals, so you can determine which actions are or will be effective. Well, if you recall, the relationship between sensory info and goals is just another way of saying value. Ultimately, this tells us 4 things. A. It won't be possible to come up with effective action without the use of value. B. Value must always be determined before or alongside effective action. C. The actions which constitute effective action should always in some way be linked to a specific value or values. And D. These two operations, determination of effective action and determination of value, are always going to travel together within the order of operations. So when you move or change one, you must always move or change the other. Now when it comes to predetermining organisms, we know that values are fixed, so we can probably conclude that, for these creatures, effective actions will be fixed as well. In fact, predetermining creatures won't need to consciously determine effective actions at all. Instead, they'll simply need to build the systems or body parts which carry out the effective actions, which is something that happens automatically at birth. For value-assigning organisms, determining effective action might often look more like the basketball example, where an entity must actively figure out the best course of action in a particular circumstance. The only exception is if an assigning system were to have genetically predisposed values and neural connections. In that case, the effective actions and the mechanisms which carry them out would also likely be predisposed. More on this in Chapter 6. Karat section 4.3. What if value determination and effective action determination are the same thing? If these two operations are as closely connected as you say, couldn't effective action determination just be an extension of the value determination process, and not its own separate operation? The simple answer is yes, that could be, at least in many cases. But it's also possible that, in some cases, these two operations are distinctly different processes happening at different times. To explain, there are two matters I need to discuss. The first matter is the difference between predetermining and assigning mechanisms. The second matter is abstraction. In predetermining organisms, value determination and effective action determination both happen before sensing info, or at birth. So it's plausible that the mechanisms used to act effectively would be built at the same time as value. And therefore, these two operations could be part of the same procedure in this case. The issue is, when it comes to assigning systems, values are generally not developed in advance, and an assigning organism doesn't always know what info it will encounter or what environments it will have to adapt to in the future. And even after it does create some values, it's possible that effective actions can't be determined right away. This means, in assigning creatures, effective action determination could sometimes be an entirely separate procedure from value determination. This is especially true when goals and values are more abstract, i.e. disconnected from the basic goals of survival and reproduction. When goals and values are highly abstract, the actions that are effective in achieving those goals may not always be immediately obvious, or may require a separate cognitive process. Intuitively, this makes sense. Knowing the relationship between your goals and some info doesn't necessarily tell you how to act on that info, at least not in all situations. This is why I ultimately included effective action determination in the list of operations. However, if effective action determination is indeed a fundamental operation of the brain, it's possible that it always occurs in a way that's inseparable or indistinguishable from the value determination process. In any case, I'm still unsure if value determination and effective action determination are separate operations, or if effective action determination even is a fundamental operation to begin with. So, as a measure of caution, I decided to separate them. Hold on a minute. You just said that effective action requires sensory info and a goal, but according to the order of operations at the beginning of the chapter, predetermining organisms create effective action before sensing info. How can these creatures determine effective action when no sensory info is there? Easy. If these organisms can create values before sensing info, then they should be able to do the same thing with effective actions. Predetermining organisms may not have sensory info right now, but if a predetermining creature already knows or has determined beforehand what info it's going to act on and what the value of that info will be, then it should be possible to determine an effective action for that info, even if it hasn't sensed anything yet. Section 4. Action. The next operation on the list is action. For the purposes of this book, action means any broad physical movement, concerted change, or patterned behavior an entity engages in. Technically, action does not have to serve the biological goals of an organism, although it often does. Out of all the operations, action is probably the one that needs the least discussion. We all know what an action is. Still, there is one thing I'd like to mention about action before we move on, something I haven't talked about yet. In predetermining creatures, actions and behaviors are very predictable, due to their systems being fixed. And in assigning systems, we know that actions and behaviors would generally be less predictable and more varied. However, there should always be patterns of behavior and physical commonalities we can observe in assigning species, including humans, and there's one reason why. Ultimately, it's still true that all organisms must accomplish biological goals to continue inhabiting this planet. And since those biological goals are unchanging, the actions of assigning creatures should often coincide, i.e. line up with, those goals, even if it isn't always direct, obvious, or explained that this is happening. In other words, despite having more adaptable systems, there should still be some predictability to the actions and behaviors of all value-assigning organisms. Karat section 4.4. Values can most likely be inherited. If we can see general trends, aka phenotypes, in the behavior and traits of assigning creatures, and if those trends can be observed in most environments, including historical environments, it may mean that there's some underlying predispositions connected to such behaviors and traits. These predispositions may be purely genetic, they may be a result of commonalities in brain structure, they may be a result of hormonal similarities, or they could stem from a wide range of factors. But whatever the case, if behavioral phenotypes exist in assigning creatures, and if all behaviors are connected to values, it probably means that values and value systems can be predisposed or even inherited in many cases. This would explain why the behaviors of assigning species aren't always random, even though their values can be developed post-sensation and even though their actions are, on the whole, much more varied than predetermining organisms. Of course, this brings up a logical question. How is it possible for genetic predisposition and value assignment to coexist? I answer that in Chapter 6, Note 3. Why can't action be the primary function of the brain? There are two main reasons. You can pick whichever one you like. 1. All organisms, including organisms without brains, must perform actions to survive or reproduce. 2. Without value, action is almost always wasteful for biological creatures, because action, by definition, is an expenditure of energy. Consider this. All biological organisms have a limited amount of energy they can spend before dying. Organisms could hypothetically take actions which have no goal behind them, but if a species of creature only took actions with no goal, all they'd be doing is spending more and more energy, and thus that species would almost certainly die off. Actions must be connected to values, at least on a regular basis, for an organism to accomplish its goals and keep the species going, which means that said action is going to depend on value, along with whatever process was used to determine value. Plus, if action by itself was the primary function of the brain, or of any biological system, you'd probably see a lot more random and needless behavior in such systems. Thus, I think we can safely conclude that action is not the main function of the brain. Section 5. Decision-making, determination of value, and the end of the main thesis. The last operation on the list is decision-making. Now, unfortunately, the discussion on decision is so big and multi-layered that I can't really delve into the whole thing here, or this would turn into a chapter which is mostly about decision-making. So instead, I'm going to dedicate the next chapter to that discussion. But there are a couple questions about decision-making that I will address here. First off, why is decision part of the assigning order of ops at all? Couldn't assigning creatures accomplish their goals without ever making decisions? Also, why can't predetermining creatures use decision-making? I'm going to try to answer both of these questions at the same time. As we've discussed, predetermining organisms are set up in such a way that their values are locked in place, i.e. fixed. So every operation which directly depends on those fixed values, such as action, should also be fixed, at least in terms of how it's executed. What this ultimately means is that the actions and behaviors of a predetermining creature should always be automatic, or occurring without any intentionality or decision. But assigning systems will be a bit different. Value assigning systems in general are going to sense wider varieties of info. When a value assigning system is dealing with enough sensory info, inevitably much of that info is going to be noise, meaning it'll have no relevance to the creature's goals and will thus be unnecessary for the creature to act on. The problem is, as I stated above, creatures only have a limited amount of energy to spend. So when important info is mixed in with a bunch of noise, and when there's only limited energy to spend, an organism may need some way of selecting what to act on and what not to. This is where decision enters the picture. Presumably, the main purpose of decision-making is to allow certain entities dealing with lots of sensory noise, to select, choose, or intentionally control what they act on, as well as when and how to act, so that they're not wasting energy responding to every trivial thing they sense. How much info does an assigning system need to detect before decision is necessary? That I can't tell you. Also, how decision works, as well as where it originates in the brain, is a totally separate issue, which will be discussed more later. But this is the basic explanation of why decision would happen in assigning organisms and not predetermining ones. Carat section 4.5. Can decision occur without action? Warning, this may be the nerdiest and most unnecessary Carat section in the whole book. Seriously, you don't need to read it. But, hypothetically, yes, decision can occur without action. As you'll see in the next chapter, the term decision is defined in such a way that it doesn't have to be an action, or result in an action. Decisions normally do result in actions, but they don't necessarily have to, at least not in all cases. However, if decision can occur without action, it might make the order of operations slightly more complicated. I'll explain. We know that value assigning systems can perform actions without any apparent decision taking place, assuming the human brain is indeed a value assigning system. Breathing, heart muscle regulation, the myotatic reflex, and every autonomic process in a human nervous system generally occurs without the host choosing for it to occur. But it may also be possible for value assigning organisms to engage in what could be considered decision-making without any observable action taking place. For instance, it would seem that a person can intentionally change what they're focusing on without actually changing their external behavior in any necessary or noticeable manner. When you think about something, that may be what's happening. You're deciding what to focus on without taking any necessary action. Yet, at the same time, one could also argue that every decision is tied to some kind of action or change in behavior, even if that change is extremely small and nearly imperceptible. For instance, a person might have slight differences in their eye movements, body language, breathing, and heart rate when thinking about a loved one versus when thinking about a traumatic event, even if those differences are hard to notice from an outside point of view. But if decision can occur without action, then the last steps of the assigning order of ops may look more like decision/action, instead of potentially decide, act. In this scenario, the decision and action operations would essentially be interchangeable, meaning they could be switched out for one another, which is weird to think about, but it could happen. To grasp this, we just have to understand the operation timeline. Let's assume that there's a timeline of operations that moves forward whenever an organism completes an operation. For example, after a predetermining creature confirms a signal, the timeline would move to action. And let's also assume that when the last available operation is performed, the timeline resets back to the first active operation. For example, after a predetermining creature completes an action, the timeline will go back to detect information, since that's the first active operation in predetermining systems. If action and decision-making are interchangeable, this process would be no different. When an organism completes an action, it would function as the final step in the order of ops, resetting the timeline. And when decision occurs without action, it would also likely function as the final operation, resetting the timeline, because in that case, decision is the last available step. In other words, when decision and action are interchangeable, decision by itself could reset the timeline, and action by itself could also reset the timeline. This is one way interchangeability could work within the order of ops. It's important to note, though, that in most cases of what we'd consider intentional choice, both action and decision-making seem to be interrelated, such that decision causes action. When a person moves their head to look at something, this action appears to be the result of a concerted and intentional choice. In my opinion, every decision an organism makes is likely connected to some kind of action or behavioral change. Not all actions are connected to decisions, but I do think all decisions result in actions. This is why I favor the potentially decide version of the assigning order of ops. As I'll continue to say though, I could be wrong. If so, the order of ops should be updated. Why can't decision-making be the primary function of the brain? Because in most cases, decision-making will be dependent on the process of value assignment. Just like with action, the only way for an organism to make an effective decision, i.e. a decision which achieves or moves it closer to its goals, is by using some kind of value. And just like with action, decision without value is biologically wasteful most of the time, at least when that decision results in an action. It is possible for a creature to make decisions without goals behind them, but unless those decisions have goals at least some of the time, they'll simply be exhausting energy. Besides, if I'm correct, the entire purpose of decision-making is to support the action operation, allowing actions to occur selectively. and in order to do that, you generally need value. Now, on one hand, it's true that we don't really see decision occurring outside of value assigning systems, meaning that decision-making is an operation which is unique to nervous systems. But just because decision might be a unique operation, doesn't mean decision-making is the brain's main function. Remember, if what I've argued is correct, value assignment is also a unique operation. Which leads us to an important observation. We've now gone over every operation on the list, and all of them are either A, not happening in the brain, B, not unique to the brain, or C, highly dependent on value assignment. That is, except for value assignment itself. Under this hypothesis, value assignment is the only unique operation in the brain which doesn't depend on some other unique operation. In other words, it's a one-of-a-kind. If the main difference between predetermining and assigning systems is that determination of value, and every operation which depends on it, is active in assigning systems, then it might suggest that this switch to activity is the reason why assigning systems exist in the first place, i.e. the main function of the brain. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe this argument isn't compelling or convincing to you. Maybe this all just sounds like a bunch of hoopla. Yeah, sure, action and decision-making might depend on value assignment, but doesn't value assignment technically depend on sensation? According to the beginning of this chapter, creatures need to complete all universal operations, not just value assignment, for the system to work, function, or run properly. So if the brain needs all of these operations, couldn't you say that the brain has no main function? Indeed, one could look at it that way. But here's something you might not have thought about. Value assigning systems always cost more energy than predetermining systems. Remember, in assigning systems, there are an extra two operations which become active: determination of value and determination of effective action. This means any creature using an assigning system must spend extra energy performing those two operations. Why does this matter? Because if we assume that the fundamental goals of all biological systems are survival and reproduction, and if all biological systems have limited energy to spend, it brings up a critical question. If predetermining systems are perfectly capable of surviving and reproducing without modification, then why would assigning systems exist at all? The conditions of the natural world don't exactly have a history of being pleasant and forgiving, quite the opposite in fact. How could a system succeed when this new system spends more energy to accomplish the same goals? It doesn't make sense. That is, unless there's something the new system can do that the old systems can't, i.e. some kind of major advantage the new system gives to the organism. Well, if everything I've argued is true, assigning systems don't just have one advantage, they have a few. Not only do value assigning systems have the obvious traits we discussed, the ability to discriminate and detect more info, but by allowing creatures to form values on the spot, the process of value assignment itself would allow organisms to adapt to new environments and information quickly, whereas predetermining systems, because they have a fixed structure, could take generations to adapt to a new environment. Assigning systems could also enable an organism to be smarter. Through trial and error, an organism with adaptable values can learn which approaches are more optimal in achieving its goals, and in this way, it can gain a huge competitive edge over predetermining systems. I don't know about you, but these seem like pretty big advantages to me. So if the brain is indeed a value-assigning system, then all the previous arguments, when taken together, seem to point to the idea that the brain has a fundamental function which it may have evolved for. Under this thesis, value assignment is the first and foremost reason why a system like the brain would ever be necessary. Plus, if we take the order of operations to mean anything, value assignment is the only operation which would be unique to brains, which doesn't depend on other unique operations. And that is why value assignment may be the primary function of the brain. Now, the book doesn't end here, of course. There's still plenty left to discuss, questions that must be answered, and topics that must be explored. But arguably, the biggest question that still needs addressing is, how would decision-making work? This is one subject I've avoided talking about so far, and for good reason. Although this thesis has been mostly straightforward up to now, the conversation about decision is not so clean and simple. Fortunately, there may be a specific reason why decision-making is so hard to solve, a problem at the root which might be complicating things. That very problem is what the next chapter will be about. Up next, Chapter 5, The Problem of the Decision Maker. So we've now gone over the book's main hypothesis. This chapter will be a little bit different from the others. Rather than leading to a single conclusion, I'm simply going to talk about a problem that exists. Specifically, it's one of the biggest remaining problems that must be solved if we want a complete understanding of the brain's fundamental operations. Like the chapter's title states, I call this problem the problem of the decision maker, or PDM for short. However, since this problem involves so many elements and topics, I'm going to be splitting this chapter into parts, kind of like the sections from the last chapter, but longer. In the first part, I'm going to define the term decision. In the second part, I'll describe the problem of the decision maker itself. And in part 3, I'll answer various important questions people might have after hearing about the PDM. Now, you don't necessarily have to read the first 4 chapters to understand what's in this chapter, but I'd recommend doing so because it will give a greater context to what's being discussed here, and because some of the stuff from the previous chapters will be referenced. Part 1. The definition of decision. Before we can talk about the problem of the decision maker, there's a question we need to answer. What is a decision? Well, unfortunately, the term decision is difficult to define accurately because we don't yet understand exactly how decisions work in nervous systems from a scientific standpoint, and it's hard to precisely define something when you're not totally sure of what it is, mechanically speaking. This means that any definition I use is going to rely heavily on my own assumptions and interpretations of what's going on. Of course, there are various dictionary definitions of decision we could use, definitions which are less technical. But since this is a book about brain function, and since I'm aiming to discuss decision-making on a technical level, I'm not going to use any popular dictionary definition. Instead, I'm going to use my own definition, which will hopefully work for the purposes of this book. I can't claim that my definition will satisfy everyone, especially since it's not complete, but it should at least be a good starting point for discussing decision-making in nervous systems. That said, I'm defining a decision as an action selection process normally resulting in an action which a. can't be wholly explained by factors, forces, or processes outside of, or not originally part of, the action taker, and which b. appears non-inexorable to the action taker. The reason this definition is incomplete is because it doesn't tell us anything about the neurological or mechanical components which go into decisions. Also, terms like outside of and not originally part of can be interpreted in different ways. Also, the definition might sound too sciencey and long-winded. But just like with everything else in this book, I'll take things slowly and explain it one step at a time so that we can all understand what's going on here. Let's start with the first part of the definition, an action selection process normally resulting in an action. I probably don't have to tell you what an action is. I defined action in the last chapter as any broad physical movement, concerted change, or patterned behavior an entity engages in, but that's just technical speak for something that you do. In fact, pretty much anything that you do, or that any organism does, can be considered an action. Therefore, action selection is obviously just the process by which an entity selects actions. And of course, when you select an action, you usually end up carrying out that action if you can, which means decisions normally result in actions. Because of this, people often think of decisions as being a certain kind of action. However, the actions which come from decisions aren't just any old actions. Instead, decisions result in special kinds of actions. What kind of actions, you may ask? Actions which can't be wholly explained by factors, forces, or processes outside of, or not originally part of, the action taker. Here's the easy way of thinking about this. If something in the world makes you act a certain way, as in physically makes you, that action was definitely not a decision, or a result of decision. For instance, if person A is sitting still at a desk, like reading a comic book or something, and person B comes along and kicks A's foot over to the side, person A's foot movement clearly wasn't person A's decision. The only actions which could possibly be decisions are actions which were not forced to happen by some outside factor or process. Decisions can, of course, be influenced by outside factors. For example, if you heard a sudden loud sound behind you, you'd probably want to turn around to look at who or what is making that sound. But when a behavior is completely a result of outside factors, if the entire movement has an external physical cause, then we know that the behavior wasn't decision-related. Karat section 5.1, on causation. At this point, I've talked about things being forced to happen, but what does that mean exactly? Well, it's complicated. In the real world, causation can be much harder to determine. The fact is, we don't always know what causes certain outcomes in the universe. It could also be the case that nothing in the universe is 100% deterministic, which means direct causation might not even exist, at least not the way we understand it. But we can usually infer, from knowledge of various disciplines such as physics, biology, anatomy, math, etc., what things are likely to occur and what things aren't in different situations. For instance, if a boxer gets knocked out by a head punch during a fight and falls down, we can analyze the circumstances of that fight to figure out whether a knockout was likely. Was the boxer exhausted? Was he protecting his head? Was he getting hit prior to the knockout? Does the boxer have a history of head trauma? Where on the head did the knockout punch land? How hard was the opponent really hitting? If certain conditions are met, we know that it'll be more likely for the boxer to get knocked out. But, depending on the case, it may also be possible that the boxer chose to fall down and is pretending to be knocked out. The point is, direct causation can often be difficult, if not impossible, to measure, and this is another reason why my definition of decision may be incomplete, because in order to say that an action can be wholly explained by factors, forces, or processes outside an entity, you'd have to know causation. However, I think there are generalities that it's possible to make about causal processes, at least at the level of common observation. And because of this, I believe that Part A of the definition of decision should suffice, at least as a starting point. The last part of the definition says action which appears non-inexorable to the action taker. So what the hell does this mean? What is inexorable? Really, inexorable is just a fancy word for unstoppable. Therefore, non-inexorable means not unstoppable. So basically, if something appears non-inexorable, that thing appears like it can be stopped. This might sound like a small technicality, but it's actually extremely crucial, because every action we associate with decision is something that appears like it can be stopped by the person or thing taking the action. And I'll show you. If we saw someone tossing a ball up and down, most of us wouldn't view the ball itself as a decision maker, because the ball is simply reacting to physical forces enacted on it. The ball cannot stop itself from being tossed. However, the person tossing the ball is generally viewed as a decision maker, because we assume the person can stop themselves from tossing it at any point if they wanted to. When something can't be stopped, we never view it as a decision. If a meteor was hurtling towards a planet and then crashed into it, we wouldn't view the meteor or the planet as decision makers, because neither the hurtling nor the crashing could presumably be stopped by the objects involved in the crash. Or how about this? Let's say you're walking down the street at night. Then, out of nowhere, someone approaches you, points a laser pointer at you, and tells you to hand your wallet over. And instead of resisting, you proceed to give them your wallet. Most people would look at that behavior, you handing your wallet over, as a decision. Why? Because even though your actions are being coerced, aka influenced, in the moment, it is still possible for you not to give the thief your wallet. In other words, you could technically stop your behavior if you really wanted to. But let's say, instead of holding a laser pointer, the thief is wielding a futuristic high-tech device that can control people's minds. And then, using that device, the thief commands you to give your wallet over. In that case, most people wouldn't view your behavior as a decision, because in that hypothetical situation, it'd probably be impossible for you not to hand them your wallet. In other words, you cannot stop yourself. In both cases, you're performing the exact same action, but only one of the actions is viewed as a decision, the one that you can presumably stop from happening. Karat section 5.2. What about internal processes? Environmental and external factors are not always what force actions in the world. Sometimes internal processes can force an entity to act a certain way. For instance, if you have a neurological condition which causes you to fall asleep randomly throughout the day, aka narcolepsy, your condition isn't being caused by an outside physical force, but rather an internal condition occurring inside your brain. However, most people who know what narcolepsy is at least still won't think of your random sleeping as a decision because it appears to be inexorable. You can't stop yourself from falling asleep, it's just part of your condition. In order to prevent random sleep from happening, you could install some sort of electrical device which zaps you right before you pass out. But in that case, you're not stopping the sleep yourself through solely internal effort. The sleep is technically being stopped by an outside device, a device which wasn't originally part of your body, and thus your random sleeping still can't be choice-related. This is why the definition of decision says outside of or not originally part of the entity. This discussion gets more tricky when talking about psychiatric conditions. Many psychiatric conditions do seem to be part of the brain to some extent. Whether or not they're originally part of the brain is another question, and probably depends on the condition. To further complicate things, it seems to be the case that individuals can make decisions while under the influence of a psychiatric condition, but the condition will almost always influence the decisions being made. Also, in certain cases, it's possible that decisions can actually affect the psychiatric condition itself to some small degree. But, generally speaking, psychiatric conditions seem to be resistant to direct stoppability. The good thing is, we don't need to fully understand psychiatric conditions to have a definition of decision, because if we view psychiatric conditions as a structure or framework under which decisions can occur, similar to how an employee works under a large company, then we can separate psychiatric conditions from decisions in a meaningful way. Companies can obviously have strong influence on employee behavior, and in certain cases, an employee's behavior can affect the company. Also, the cumulative actions of employees can result in larger changes to the company. But generally speaking, the company is not going to change substantially based on the behavior of one employee. Remember, for an action to be considered decision type, that action must appear stoppable. And psychiatric conditions themselves don't generally appear like they can be stopped in any direct or immediate manner by the person with the condition. Thus, these conditions can't fall under the classification of decision. But, of course, this all leads to a question. What if everything in the universe is unstoppable, including everything that happens in our brain? What if everything we do is essentially involuntary, automatic, or forced to happen? For example, our reality could just be a digital simulation where all our thoughts and behaviors have been pre-programmed by a high-powered computer intelligence. Or it could just be the case that everything in the universe is deterministic and predestined, including brain function. If one of these possibilities was true, would decision still exist? I'm glad you asked. The answer is yes, decision would still exist. Here's why. If you paid attention, the definition of decision didn't just say appears non-inexorable. It said appears non-inexorable to the action taker. This is the most important part of the definition and what differentiates decisions from all other things in the universe. Think about it. Whenever you do something that you think of as a decision, like picking up a glass of water, that action won't just seem stoppable to others, it will also seem stoppable to you. When you move your arm to pick up a drink, even you unconsciously and instinctively assume that this movement can be stopped. In other words, the action appears to the action taker as non-inexorable. Even if everything in the universe was fundamentally unstoppable, the fact that certain actions appear to be stoppable, even to the entity taking the action, is what ultimately causes us to recognize and think of these actions differently from other actions. These are the actions that I label decisions. Karat section 5.3, Proving decisions are deterministic. In order to prove that decisions are deterministic, there are two things you'd have to do scientifically. Number 1, you'd need to more clearly define what a decision is neurologically. Currently, there are studies showing that specific, predictable brain activity occurs before certain actions that humans take. According to one study, actions can be predicted up to 11 seconds in advance by looking at brain activity. See source 17 in description. But the main problem with these studies is that they only show certain brain activity is correlated with certain actions. They do not necessarily show the process of decision occurring or prove that decision is deterministic. Also, sometimes the researchers performing these studies will assume that the participants' actions are the participants' decisions, but that might not necessarily be the case. Under this book's definition at least, decision has to do with action selection. Just because you can predict certain actions by looking at brain activity does not mean that the brain activity you're observing must be the action selection process, because it could be the case that the action selection process occurs before the observed brain activity. To put it simply, the brain activity these researchers observed might not be the process of decision itself, but might instead be an after effect of decision. Something else to note is that these studies only predict actions under extremely controlled conditions and only give participants extremely limited choices, like pressing one of two buttons, saying one of two words, or picking one of two images. This is important because in the real world, outside the lab, people aren't usually limited to one or two choices at any given time. Usually real-world decision-making is, and has to be, much more complex. Ultimately, to prove decisions are deterministic, it's not enough just to correlate certain kinds of brain activity with certain kinds of actions. You'd have to delineate, or come to a collective agreement about, what brain activity is necessarily part of decision and what isn't. What about decision-type brain activity separates it from all other types of brain activity, such that a meaningful or practical distinction can be drawn? Number 2, you'd have to demonstrate that all decision-type brain activity is inexorable. Again, it's not enough to show that certain brain activity is associated with a decision. You'd have to demonstrate that such activity must necessarily have occurred in that circumstance, which is an entirely different hypothesis with different falsifiability conditions. We know that the passing of time can affect the process of choice. If I put you in a room and told you to hit a button as many times as you could, the rate and speed at which you hit that button would probably change the longer you stay in the room, even if your muscles couldn't get tired. But this creates an issue. To prove a decision must necessarily have occurred, you'd have to observe the same decision in the exact same conditions, including temporal conditions. In other words, you'd need to be able to go back in time and observe the same decision twice, which would obviously require a time machine. But since we don't yet have time machines, it's not possible to know if a participant's choices and the correlated brain activity will always happen at the same moment, will always take the same route, or whether there's some variability / non-determinism to the whole process. It would also probably help to explain why decisions appear the way they do. If every action in the brain is essentially unstoppable, why is it that some actions seem like they can be stopped, even to the individual taking the action? What specific phenomenon creates that appearance? Is it simply the absence of an observable causal process that makes us assume non-inexorability, or might it be something else? If you can't pull off both number 1 and number 2, then you can't say with certainty that decisions are deterministic. Now, for a variety of reasons, which I explained in previous chapters, creatures with nervous systems seem to be the only creatures in the world capable of making what I consider decisions. With this, we can move on to the next part. Part 2, the problem. So now that we have a basic definition of decision, we can ask the next question. Why has decision-making been so difficult for scientists and psychologists to get a grasp on? I mean, shouldn't it be pretty easy for us to figure out how decision works? Really, what's so hard about deciphering the brain mechanisms behind how a chimpanzee picks up a berry, or how a bird chooses to tilt its head, or how a person selects what to eat? Karat section 5.4, Matters of Consciousness. Some people may think these examples, a chimpanzee picking up an object, a bird choosing which way to tilt its head, and a person selecting something, are all issues of consciousness. However, for the purposes of this chapter, I'm going to treat consciousness and decision-making as separate topics. The two may be, and probably are, connected at some level, but for now I'm going to concentrate on the decision-making side of this discussion. Consciousness will be examined more in the next chapter. These behaviors all appear extremely simple, so it might seem like they'd be easy to map out scientifically, but such is not the case. Scientists and medical professionals have, of course, spent plenty of time studying the brain. There is no shortage of research, especially in the last century, showing how certain parts of brain activity correlate with certain actions, emotions, and psychological states. Psychologists have also spent lots of time studying the outward behavior of organisms with brains. Because of this, they can identify general trends in the behavior of an individual, a species, or a group, as well as the likelihood of specific actions under certain conditions. Unfortunately, in order to fully grasp decision-making, it's not enough to study the general likelihood of behaviors. You need some kind of model, framework, or algorithm which consistently and accurately predicts decisions. In other words, you need a theory to go along with the observations you're making, a theory which explains exactly how environment, brain activity, and decision/behavior are linked. And at the current moment, outside of highly controlled settings, no one has a theoretical model which can consistently and precisely predict a large percent of decisions any organism with a brain will make. So why has a theory on decision been so difficult to create? Well, some of it is due to the limits of neuroscience. There are a giant number of variables which factor into brain function, and that alone is going to make it tough to build any psychological theory. With modern technology, neuroscientists have made pretty good progress in mapping out these structures and activities, at least in humans. And yet, to this day, psychologists don't agree on how to model all this theoretically. This is where the problem of the decision maker comes into play. See, I suspect there's another reason why these theories on decision are so difficult to construct/agree on. Many times, when people attempt to build theories on decision making, they start from the assumption that all brain processes are deterministic. In other words, they assume that a strict set of rules is guiding the brain's activities and decisions, similar to how a set of rules would guide the behavior of a robot or computer program. If all brain processes are deterministic, then all you'd have to do to solve decision-making is come up with the correct mathematical formula or set of rules. Easy, right? There's just one big issue with this kind of approach. The number of sensory inputs in most nervous systems is so large that it usually makes deterministic solutions absurdly difficult. Let's say you're a programmer trying to program a tiny robot, and on this robot's head are two tiny sensors which can detect different colors. One of the sensors can detect the color red when something red is in front of the robot. The other sensor detects the color yellow when something yellow is in front of the robot. Basically, to the robot, red means threat, and yellow means food. When the robot sees something red, the robot is programmed to move backward, and when the robot sees something yellow, it's programmed to move forward. Simple, no problems here. But what happens if the robot sees nothing at all? What's it supposed to do in that situation? And how should the robot react if it sees both red and yellow at the same time? Well, if your goal is to create a robot that can function in the world by itself, without humans needing to change and update the robot all the time, you probably want your robot to be as versatile as possible, which means you have to maximize the number of environments, situations, and scenarios that the robot can handle. Therefore, with just two sensory inputs, red and yellow, the number of scenarios you, as the programmer, must take into account is actually 4. Red plus yellow, and none. If you added a third sensor, let's say green, things become even more complicated, because you must now include each of the combinations involving green. So with 3 inputs, the number of scenarios you must program the robot for is now 8. Red plus yellow, red plus green, yellow plus green, red plus yellow plus green, and none. If you add a 4th sensor, the number of scenarios becomes 16. 5 sensors will give you 32 scenarios, 6 sensors will give you 64, etc. If you notice something, there's a pattern here. With each added input, the amount of scenarios you have to manage doubles. This is because when you're building a robot to navigate as many situations and environments as possible, the sensors alone aren't the only thing that matters. What also matters is the fact that multiple sensors, or none, can be active at once. Of course, when your robot has a very small number of sensors, this isn't too much of a concern, but things quickly get out of hand the more inputs you add on. For instance, with just 18 sensors, the robot will have to account for 262,144 possible scenarios. More than 30 sensors, and you're talking billions of scenarios to manage. Now, for those who aren't aware, the average adult human brain has around 86 billion neurons, and a very large percent of them are what neuroscientists call sensory neurons. Neurons capable of detecting some kind of information outside or inside the body, aka the inputs of the brain. Needless to say, this creates a quandary. When you have that many sensory inputs in a system, the number of scenarios a deterministic decision maker will have to account for is, well, ludicrous. So coming up with a set of rules that accounts for all those scenarios is going to be inhumanely difficult. If that wasn't bad enough, this kind of system would also need some way of computing the different actions the robot could take in each relevant scenario, and must also have a way of picking which action to take. If the robot is highly advanced, it might even need a way of switching the goals that it performs, as well as updating how it performs those goals, so it can continue operating without human intervention. Because if the robot's environment changes drastically enough, the robot's goals, or at least the way it performs those goals, will likely need to change as well. And this creates an even larger number of things to calculate. And of course, the robot must also view its own actions as non-inexorable. All of this combined is what I refer to as the problem of the decision maker, or PDM. You could also call it the many sensors problem, or the doubling problem. Still, some people might not see this as a very big hurdle. And I admit, the problem itself is actually quite simple when you boil it down. It's so simple, an intelligent person might think, this whole PDM thing sounds like a bunch of hootenanny. You can probably just solve it with a few basic tricks. Well, that leads us to the next part of the chapter. Part 3. Important Q&A. Here are a few important questions some of you might have after hearing about the problem of the decision maker. 1. What if the robot's sensors don't always have to be on? In fact, what if all of Mr. Robot's sensors are off, except for a small area where the sensors are basically active, sort of like a point of focus? Maybe the robot could even be built so that it can change its point of focus when needed. If you programmed it this way, the robot would only need to process the sensors which are in the active region, so wouldn't that reduce the total amount of scenarios that the robot has to calculate? Technically, yes, it would. But this then begs the question, what set of rules would drive that point of focus? Also, how will the robot know which inputs to turn on and off, and when? These sound like easy questions to answer, but the second one leads to a paradox. Imagine for a moment that you have a magical closet, and in this closet are many magical shirts. Now these shirts, being magical and all, will sometimes morph in shape, size, color, and design. However, there's a catch. The interior of the closet is almost pitch black, so you can't see any of these shirts, except for the one you're currently wearing. Now you can swap shirts whenever you want, and once you pick a shirt, it stops morphing. But this closet also makes it so you can only be touching one shirt at a time, meaning you have to take off the shirt you're currently wearing and put it back on the rack if you want to pick out another. So the conundrum is, if you're inside this magical closet, how can you determine which shirt is the best to wear, if the only shirt you can ever see while in the closet is the shirt you're currently wearing? It's a paradox. If you want to pick the best shirt, you'd have to see all the shirts currently available, which you can't do. The only practical solution to this paradox is to keep picking shirts at random until you find one you like, which is also the right size. But if you're in a hurry and need to get dressed at this very moment, that solution probably wouldn't be optimal. This, in essence, is the issue with our robot having a point of focus where certain sensors are active and the rest are inactive. How can the robot know when to change the information it's looking at if the only thing it can base that change on is the information it's currently looking at? The robot could keep switching its focus point at random until it finds something it needs to act on, and this might even work occasionally. But if you're trying to create a robot which achieves goals in an efficient and effective manner, that tactic probably won't be ideal. 2. Okay, but what if the point of focus works differently than that? What if the sensors outside the robot's focus don't necessarily have to be off or inactive? Our minds seem like they can focus on things, right? Well, when a person focuses on something, it's not like the sensory info outside our focus point just completely and totally shuts off. Maybe the robot could be built so that all of its sensors are on, but only some of its sensors, the ones inside the focus point, are being processed or calculated, while the other sensors can be used for some other task. For example, the sensors outside the focus point could be placed on a sort of standby mode, where they won't be actively processed but can still inform the robot about various things in the vicinity that might be important to focus on. The robot could even have some type of memory of past inputs so that it doesn't need to constantly look around to figure out what's in its environment. Now we're getting somewhere. Yes, it's possible that this could work. This may even be something that occurs in organisms with nervous systems, at least roughly speaking. Unfortunately, even if we know this, it still doesn't answer our previous question. What mathematical formula or set of rules would drive the robot's focus point? Also, where and how would that memory be stored? Remember, the PDM isn't just about the number of scenarios the robot must calculate, it's also about the number of possible actions that must be calculated, as well as when and how to take those actions. And if your robot is able to have memory of these scenarios and actions as well, you may now have a problem which is even more complicated than the one I described in Part 2. Lastly, even if you could build a system like this that works with small robots or systems, it still might not solve the problem of the decision maker in the human brain. Because even when you reduce the number of sensors being processed, there could still be millions, potentially even billions, of inputs which are active inside a human brain's point of focus, which means you'll still have to calculate an unreasonable number of scenarios and actions. 3. Okay, well, what about other species? Animal brains and nervous systems don't all have as many neurons as the human brain does, so maybe it would be easier to figure out how smaller nervous systems make decisions. And if we can figure out how they make decisions, maybe we could use that knowledge to solve human decision making. Sure, this could be true, and yes, other species do have different nervous systems, with different numbers of sensory inputs. But generally speaking, most animal nervous systems still have a large enough amount of sensory inputs that it's a problem. For instance, the average ant is estimated to have about 250,000 neurons in its brain, which is far fewer than the human brain. See source 15 in description. Well, hypothetically, if only 20% of an ant's neurons were sensory neurons, and if the ant could only focus on about 5,000 of those sensors at one time, that's still, well, it's a whole big number of scenarios that a deterministic decision maker would have to account for at any given moment. You could go smaller than an ant's brain to solve decision making. However, when you're dealing with animals that small, it's going to be hard to find commonalities or corollaries with the human brain. Which means even if you can figure out how decision works in such tiny creatures, it may be hard to carry that knowledge over into human decision making. I'm not saying it couldn't be done though. 4. Okay, but can't today's technologies, such as modern computer systems, modern phones, internet services like Google, and modern AI, process large amounts of data extremely quickly? So isn't it still possible for them to solve the PDM, just with sheer computing power? The answer to this is a bit more complicated. Yes, it's true that sophisticated technological systems and devices exist in the current day, and yes, they can generally handle very large amounts of info very rapidly. But even though modern technologies can do this, they still can't, as far as I'm aware, solve the PDM, even with increasing amounts of computational power, and it has to do with how they process data. I'm about to use a weird analogy, but it'll make sense once I explain it. Let's say you're in a gun building competition with a dozen other people, and each of you have 24 hours to build a gun that must fire 1 million bullets. After the 24 hours are up, the person whose gun fires all million bullets the fastest wins. From a builder's perspective, would it be easier to build a gun that fires all million bullets simultaneously, or would it be easier to simply build a gun that fires one bullet at a time? Obviously, the second option would be easier, because all else being equal, building something that performs one action will usually cost less energy and require fewer components than building something that performs large amounts of that same action. Plus, even if your gun only fires one bullet at a time, as long as you can get your gun to fire really fast, you might stand a chance at winning. Then again, maybe you don't need to build a gun that fires all 1 million bullets simultaneously. What if you could just build a gun that fires lots of bullets, like 10,000 at the same time? Well, in that case, you'd probably have a serious advantage over the single-fire guns, even if your 10,000 bullet gun could only shoot about once every minute or so. It sounds odd, but the way brains and technology process data is sort of similar. Modern computers and technological systems, although they've gotten faster over the years, are kind of like the single-fire gun. When you go down to the smallest level, the info processing components of these systems, transistors, logic gates, memory cells, etc., can generally only process information one bit at a time. Of course, if you put billions of these one bit at a time components together, make them efficient, and get them to work quickly, you can achieve remarkably high processing speeds. But what if you had a component that was different? What if you had a tiny info processor which, unlike computer technology, could handle many bits, as in thousands, at the same time? If you put billions of those components into one system, made them efficient, and got them to work quickly, you'd probably have a major processing advantage over computer-based technologies, or at the very least, you'd have a system with different advantages than a computer. Well, in a nutshell, that's how the brain works. Neurons, the smallest data processing components in the brain, can typically process multiple signals at once. In some cases, a single neuron can receive signals from up to 10,000 other neurons simultaneously. See source 16. Even the most advanced technological systems, programs, and devices today simply can't do that. 5. Okay, well, what if you just put thousands of super-fast computers together? Couldn't you process more info than a brain that way? Technically, yes, you could, but only if you're looking at the total amount of information processed. Since brains and computers handle data in fundamentally different ways, it leads to fundamental differences in the way these systems operate and what they can actually do with that data. Even if you put many high-speed computers together, there will still be limitations that computers have which brains don't. For example, a human can often glance at another person's facial expression and, in a fraction of a second, get a general sense of what the other person is feeling. I'm talking about basic emotional state, not psychological conditions such as depression. Computer programs today still have a hard time with this. Of course, there are plenty of limitations that brains have that computers don't. For example, there are computer programs which can, in a fraction of a second, examine hundreds of thousands of news headlines, pick out all the headlines containing the word bank, and then list those news articles by date. And they can do this with an extremely high degree of accuracy. No human today is capable of that. Basically, these differences stem from how information is handled in these systems. Sure, when it comes to fictional gun-building competitions, maybe the only thing that matters is the total number of bullets being fired. But when it comes to solving the PDM, it's probably not just about the total amount of data processed. It's probably also about the way your system processes data. Karat Section 5.5, Structure Sensitivity. Another difference to mention is, the majority of technology today is highly structure sensitive, meaning if you break or remove one critical component, like the RAM, CPU, or graphics driver, or modify one key piece of code, like a null pointer, dependency, or system32, the entire thing will often just stop working. Of course, brains are structure sensitive as well, but in general, brains seem to be much less structure sensitive than today's technology. There are many parts of the brain that can be destroyed, removed, or separated, while the brain as a whole still retains functionality. That doesn't mean you should try. The brain might not necessarily work the same way after such damage, but it will often still work, and this is yet another example of how differently brains and technologies operate. 6. What if you're wrong? What if modern tech is getting so advanced that it can solve the problem of the decision maker even with the limitations you just talked about? Well, that might be the case. Humans have certainly developed many ingenious devices and technology in the modern day. I won't deny that the PDM could be solved in the future using some clever innovation. But if you want evidence that the PDM is still currently unsolvable, all we need to do is look at some examples. Take any group of technologies today. They can be the most advanced devices, programs, computers, or AIs you can think of. And most likely, they'll all have one very specific commonality. Every technology available to us today requires an outside party, either user or programmer, to give it a goal to perform. Humans don't seem to have that limitation. If I wanted to drop everything I'm doing and spend the rest of my life studying the art of trapeze, I could. No one has to tell me what goals to perform, and nothing is preventing me from changing the goals I'm performing at a moment's notice. This may sound silly or trivial, but it's extremely significant because all current-day technological systems, no matter how advanced, require goals to be administered by someone or something outside of the system. Take for example Stockfish, which is one of the strongest chess programs in the world. Currently, Stockfish can beat any human player in the game of chess, even the human world champion. One thing Stockfish cannot do, however, is change what game it's playing. It's programmed to play a specific game using a specific set of rules. If you wanted Stockfish to play a different game, like Othello, or perform different kinds of tasks, a programmer would have to rework the system to accomplish these goals. We could also look at ChatGPT, which is currently a popular AI interface. At the moment, ChatGPT is capable of producing a wide array of outputs, from generating code to teaching you a new language to coming up with business ideas. It can even be programmed to control robotic movements in a limited capacity. Yet, ChatGPT still requires a human to ask it a question or give it some kind of prompt, i.e. a goal, in order to generate an output or answer. Even in the cases where ChatGPT can move robots, a user or programmer still needs to give ChatGPT goals and tasks to perform while in the robot. Humans, on the other hand, can not only decide our own actions and movements, we can also, seemingly, decide our own goals and priorities, to some extent. Yes, it's true that all humans and organisms have biological goals, which there's no way for us to control. But even then, it's still possible for us to act against our own biological goals. I can choose to starve myself or to not have babies, for instance. We can also create new and unique goals which exist separately from these biological goals. I can learn to drive race cars or play sports, or even invent a new sport, for instance. The ability to choose and create goals is such a fundamental part of human decision-making that it would be hard to imagine our lives without it. And yet, no technology today can do the same. No technology can determine its own goals unprompted, create its own new and unique goals outside of its programming, or act against its own programmed goals. And this is evidence that the PDM is still unsolvable through modern technology. 7. One last question. What if you had a way of programming values into the robot? Basically, the robot could associate sensory inputs with other sensory inputs in order to create computeristic values. You could even have some sort of hierarchy that determines which values are the most important to act on, as well as how to act on them. Then all the system has to do is compare values to other values to determine the robot's actions. So instead of calculating all the scenarios that the robot might encounter, the robot only has to calculate values. Couldn't this solve the PDM? Well, believe it or not, people have built similar kinds of systems before. They're called neural nets, and neural nets are responsible for a great many technological innovations. But there's still a fundamental flaw with this technology, and it's exactly what we talked about above. Neural nets, along with all other modern technologies, still don't determine their own goals and priorities. The hierarchies that neural nets use to generate actions must still be determined by an outside party. For example, if I wanted my neural net to control self-driving cars, I'll normally need to spend time and resources training my neural net to accomplish that specific objective. But let's say I get bored of self-driving cars and want my neural net to do other things, like recognize and categorize faces by age. In that case, I'll most likely have to retrain the system using different sorts of data, different values, and a different hierarchy, all of which I create. I could make a neural net which performs many goals and tasks like ChatGPT does by training the system with different kinds of data, but for my system to take any actions, someone will still need to tell it what to do and what tasks to perform. Karat section 5.6, the quantifiability of values. Also, if your goal is to mimic or model real-world brain function using the classic neural net method, then you're going to run into a pretty big issue. In a traditional computer, anything you compute, including your computerized values, will have to come in a linear or numeric format. This is because most computers, at the moment, make finite calculations, and a system which makes finite calculations requires something finite to calculate. If something doesn't come in a linear or numeric form, it will have to be transcribed, i.e. quantified, in a linear or numeric way so that it can be computed. But if you remember what I argued in the intro and chapter 1, values in the brain are not linear or numeric, and something which is fundamentally non-linear or non-numeric is going to be difficult, if not impossible, to accurately quantify. This means that any system using the neural net method of creating values probably won't be totally accurate or faithful to values in the brain, at least not if my book is right. Of course, even after all I've argued, it is hypothetically possible that the subjective values of the brain could be linear or numeric. If one only looks at the activation state of a neuron, it might appear linear, either active or inactive. But because of how neurons function, because many signals can be incorporated into a single neuron's activation state, it's probably safe to say that the way value works in the brain is not comparable to a traditionally linear or numeric system. My suspicion is that, to faithfully recreate values technologically, one must faithfully recreate the neuron itself, or at least create a neuron-like component, which functions within a computerized environment. To put it simply, the best neural nets right now are more like sophisticated pattern identifiers rather than decision-making machines. They don't determine their own objectives, and they're generally still reliant on a programmer to define the system's rules and hierarchies. This is probably why you never see these types of machines gaining sentience. Now, it is imaginably possible that, in the future, a neural net or neural net type system could be able to select its own goals, or even create new goals, unprompted. Maybe, somehow, a technology could even be built that's able to act against its own programmed goals. But, even if neural nets could do this, the problem of the decision maker still wouldn't be solved. Remember, to solve the PDM, your system must be able to make decisions, which means there must be some action selection process resulting in actions that appear non-inexorable to the action taker. And in order to view one's own actions as anything, there must be something there doing the viewing. There must be something inside the robot which isn't just sensing information, but is experiencing that information. In other words, it's possible that some level of consciousness may already need to be present within the system. Related to this is the problem of the body. One of the reasons why machines may never be conscious is because machines do not have bodies. Humans are able to become more intelligent and improve our own understandings, because many of the ideas we have we can test against our environment. And the reason we can do that is because we have bodies with sensory experiences, which seem to exist separate from our environment. Artificial intelligence has no distinct body to speak of, and thus it cannot test whether any of its conclusions are true or line up with its sensory experience. To determine what's true, AI is entirely reliant on what humans tell it. It cannot directly test any of the things humans tell it. Machines have no option but to trust that we're giving them good data, which places a hard limit on their intelligence. Since human consciousness is directly connected to our sensory experience, and since biological bodies may be necessary for sensory experience, it means machines may never be conscious in the way humans are. However, you might not need to recreate decision itself to solve most of the PDM. If you can create a system which is able to process large enough amounts of info, pick its own goals, create new goals, and take effective actions, that might be good enough to mimic human decision-making. My definition of decision could also ultimately be wrong. At the very least, we know it's incomplete, so take of this what you will. Of course, the other possibility is that decisions in the brain are not deterministic. But I think since so many people dedicate their lives to finding deterministic solutions and creating deterministic systems, that possibility often gets ignored. It seems to me that the truth of the matter could cut either way. Decisions in the brain might be deterministic, but they also might not be. If neither case has been proven, then I think both possibilities should be considered. At least that would be the scientific approach. Plus, even if decisions aren't deterministic, there could still be some route to modeling or solving decisions technologically. It'll probably just require some innovation and creative thinking. In any case, I believe the discussion on decision will always be an interesting one worth examining. And that's curtains for this chapter. But of course, the book still isn't done. There are still thesis-related questions I haven't answered yet, like how genetic predispositions can exist in a value-assigning system. There are also subjects I've promised to discuss further, like consciousness, and topics that I still want to talk about, like how value assignment relates to emotions. This is why the next chapter is titled Chapter 6, Everything Left to Discuss. Chapter 6, Everything Left to Discuss. Okay, so the main hypothesis of the book, along with the chapter about decisions, is finally done. I've talked about value assignment and decision-making so much that you're probably sick of terms such as value and decision. But there's still important stuff to talk about that I never got around to, like where are the brain's goals, and what role do emotions, memory, and other functions play when it comes to the thesis. Well, this is the chapter where I go over those things, along with a few other topics. Unlike the other chapters, this chapter won't have a specific through line or theme. Instead, I'll be going point by point discussing various subjects and questions that I want to, or have previously promised to, talk about. Some questions will have answers, some won't. Some points will be open-ended, some won't. Some of the topics are just things I find interesting. You can think of it almost like a collection of notes in the form of a chapter. All of these notes will be connected to this book's main hypothesis in some way, but they won't all be connected to each other in terms of subject matter. Still, if you made it this far without quitting, this chapter will probably be worth a read. Plus, once this chapter's finished, the pain will all be over. So let's begin. Note 1. The consciousness discussion. Let's start off with one of the most significant topics I said that I'd address, consciousness. Now, in order to discuss consciousness, the first thing we need to do is define the term consciousness. And this is where we run into the first issue, because it seems that oftentimes people who use the term consciousness are in fact referring to different things. Some people use the term conscious to mean being awake or aware of your surroundings. For example, during the surgery she was sedated, but it only took a few hours for her to become fully conscious. Others might use the term conscious to refer to a person's intentions or the deliberateness of someone's actions. He was conscious of the crime he committed. Others still might use the term consciousness to mean one's ability to think about and verbalize their own mental/emotional states. However, when psychologists talk about the hard problem of consciousness, the type of consciousness they're referring to is generally the experience of sensation. Why is pain something we feel? Why is color something we see? Our bodies could just robotically respond to information in our environment without needing to experience that information. So why don't we do that? The experience of sensation, aka conscious experience, is, believe it or not, one of the most difficult problems to solve in psychology, which is why it's called the hard problem. Now, unfortunately, like I mentioned in the intro, my thesis won't be solving any problems of consciousness. But there are certain ways in which my thesis connects to these problems. For example, the experience of sensation might be linked to the order of operations somehow. Yes, all organisms use an order of operations according to this thesis, but not all organisms have a conscious experience, as far as we know, which means conscious experience can't be a part of all order of ops. So how could conscious experience and the order of ops be linked? Well, one possibility is that conscious experience is tied to the top-level order of operations happening in our brains. I discussed the concept of operation levels in Karat section 4.1. Under this thesis, there's an order of operations present in every biological system at every level of function, including one at the top level governing whole body functions. If there is a top-level order of ops happening in the human brain, it would at least make sense for conscious experience to be attached to it. If conscious experience was tied to lower-level systems, like the peripheral nervous system, the way we interact with the world would be very different. Sure, it could be that each of your body's systems have their own conscious experience. But when you think about your experience of the world, I'd venture to guess that you don't feel like a hair or a pimple. And maybe not all brains or nervous systems have a conscious experience. It's hard to say, but there might be plenty of creatures with nervous systems, such as worms and tiny insects, which can't experience sensation. If that is the case, we've got to ask, why does the experience of sensation happen in some brains and not others? And that's a question I can't answer. But even if conscious experience occurs only in some brains, as long as we know it's happening in our brain and is tied to a top-level order of ops, it would explain certain things about the human condition. For one, it would explain why we can make decisions. According to my definition from Chapter 5, to make decisions, an entity must be able to view its own actions as non-inexorable. And for an entity to view its own actions as non-inexorable, you must have a viewer, something which is experiencing sensory information. If there's a single top-level order of ops happening in our brain, which conscious experience is connected to, it would explain why there's a viewer for decisions, and why that viewer seems to be like one single thing, because there'd hypothetically be only one order of operations happening at the top level in our brain. This top-level hypothesis would also explain why our decisions appear unified. Technically, there are millions of tiny actions being taken in your body when you decide something, but you still probably feel as if your decisions are tied to one big action, or at least a small number of big actions. Of course, my thesis doesn't explain how conscious experience happens, or even how a top-level order of operations arises in the first place. It also doesn't explain how conscious experience becomes attached to that top-level order of ops. But ultimately, if these two things were attached, it would make sense of the above phenomena. It's also possible that certain types of consciousness are tied to specific operations occurring at the top level. The first operation in the value assigning order of ops is sensation, so it probably wouldn't be surprising if the experience of sensation was connected to that first operation. However, like I mentioned above, some people use the term consciousness to refer to intentions or the deliberateness of someone's actions. Well, both intentionality and deliberateness seem to be related to decision-making. In fact, intention and deliberation may just be different parts of, or terms for, the decision-making process, because both of them have to do with action selection. It may also be possible that some types of consciousness are actually emergent properties. As a matter of fact, in recent history, more and more scientists seem to support such an idea. I discuss what emergence is in Note 6. However, emergence doesn't answer every question about consciousness. For instance, in Carat 1.2, I asked, why is it possible for beings/systems with many individual sensory nodes to have one single subjective experience of the world? Well, this is essentially a question about consciousness, because conscious experience appears singular. In other words, nobody has multiple conscious experiences at a time. We only have one experience, at least from how it appears. This happens despite the fact that each brain is made up of billions of individual parts. Some people refer to this phenomenon as information integration, but regardless of what term you use for it, emergence alone doesn't explain why it happens. Emergence also doesn't explain why, like I stated in Carat 5.5, the brain can be damaged and still retain that singular experience, sometimes so severely that parts are destroyed, removed, or separated from one another. Still, emergence does explain certain types of consciousness. Like I mentioned above, some people use the term conscious to refer to being awake or aware of your surroundings. Well, how awake someone is or feels might be a property of emergence. If certain areas of the brain are responsible for the feeling of awakeness, then the more activity we see in those areas, the more awake you might be or feel. The same goes for awareness of your surroundings. Obviously, though, more work needs to be done on all of this. Note 2. The brain's goals. Here's another important question I said I'd address. Where exactly do goals exist in the brain and other biological systems? In Chapter 1, I stated that a value is basically a relationship between information that an entity senses and a goal that an entity has. But this brings up a problem. We know that all animals use specific observable physical structures to detect information in the outside world. Brains sense info using neurons. Other systems might use proteins or sensory hairs to detect info. However, a goal is more of an abstract idea, not an actual physical structure. So how is it possible for an organism to create a physical connection between sensory signals and goals when a goal is not really a physical thing that can be connected to? I think there are a couple answers to this question. A. As I argued in Chapter 2, the sensory and response mechanisms that predetermining creatures carry should essentially be hardwired to accomplish specific tasks at all times, which is what makes their behavior consistent and predictable. So if we're talking about predetermining organisms, the goals, you could say, are built into or part of the sensory/response mechanism itself. No physical value connection needs to be made in these systems because the values already come pre-built under this thesis, most likely when the creature is born. B. But what about in nervous systems/the brain? If this book is correct, brains are different from predetermining systems because brains can assign values. If you think about it, this means, in the brain, sensory info and goals must start off being physically disconnected from one another, which means that the goals of the brain must exist somewhere as a physical thing, at least to begin with. So where exactly are those goals? One possibility is that goals have stand-in neural structures in the brain. Neuroscientists have long understood that each of your body parts are mapped onto or represented in certain areas of the brain, areas referred to as the homunculus. See source 18 in description. Well, in a similar way, it's also possible that biological goals are mapped onto or represented in certain regions of any nervous system. So basically, when the brain forms a relationship between sensory info and goals, what the brain might actually be doing is forming a connection between A. neurons which detect some kind of info in the world, and B. neurons which stand in for or represent a specific goal. These stand-in nervous structures could be spread throughout the system, or they could be concentrated in one location. But either way, this is one technique that nervous systems/brains could use to accomplish value assignment. C. It's also possible that stand-in neural structures aren't always necessary to create values in the brain. If the only thing required for value creation is sensory info and a goal, then maybe any kind of goal, even if it's an indirect, abstract, or trivial goal, could suffice. Let's say that I want to drive to the store. In order to do that, there will be several small steps I have to take. The first step is to get up from where I am. The next step is to find my keys. The next step is to walk to my vehicle, etc. If each step in this process is like a miniature goal, then the neural connections or associations required to complete each of these goals could, hypothetically, be considered values. So depending on what kinds of things are defined as goals, then it's possible many different kinds of neural connections could be part of the value determination procedure. What sorts of tasks would be considered goals? Could something as small as moving your own pinky finger or changing what you look at count as a goal? That I don't have a definitive answer to. What about genetically predisposed neural connections? Where do the goals and values come in there? That's discussed in the next note. Which exact neural structures stand in for goals? That I also can't tell you. Most likely you'll need a neuroscientist to figure that one out. Still, I think A, B, and C are good enough to explain how goals broadly work in the brain and other biological systems. Note 3. Genetic predispositions and value assignment. I mentioned in Karat section 4.4 that it's likely many neural connections in the brain are genetically predisposed. But if that's true, it brings up a problem. A genetically predisposed value can't possibly come from value assignment, because value assignment is a process which occurs after an organism senses information, and genetic predisposition occurs before an organism can sense anything. So what's up with that? How can you have a genetically predisposed value assigning system? If researchers were to find out that most neural connections in the brain are, in some way, genetically predisposed, could you even call the brain a value-assigning system? Well, there are a few things to discuss here. First, if the brain can assign values at all, even if a large percent of connections were somehow not assigned, then you can probably still call the brain a value assigning system, because the other types of biological systems that exist, predetermining systems, cannot assign values in any capacity under this hypothesis. So basically, the fact that nervous systems/brains are even capable of value assignment is what would make the brain a value assigning system, at least in my view. Secondly, would a genetically predisposed neural connection itself be considered an assigned connection or a predetermined connection? And also, which order of operations would apply? This one's complicated. We know that genetically predisposed neural connections and neural circuits must at least use values, meaning there must be a sensory signal and some kind of goal for these predispositions to have any effect on behavior. How do we know this? Because every genetic predisposition you can think of fits this model. Take, for example, the autonomic or involuntary functions of the body, such as the heart pump function. You don't have to learn to pump your heart, meaning this function is probably inherited or genetically predisposed. To perform this function, however, a certain process must take place. First, there must be a sensory signal which kicks off or initiates the function, otherwise your heart would never pump. Then the system must determine, or have determined beforehand, the importance of that sensory signal, meaning there must be a value in there somewhere, so that the system knows what to do with the initial signal. Then the system must take some kind of action, such as contracting the muscles of your heart, causing it to pump. The whole process then repeats. Obviously, it's more complex in real life. This is just a simplified overview. If this process sounds kind of like an order of operations, that's because it is. The heart pump mechanism, breathing, hair growth, every reflex you have, every motor skill, all of these functions under this thesis must involve some order of operations. The question is, which order of ops are these genetic predispositions using? Is it the predetermining one, or is it the assigning one? I think the answer is, it depends. Yes, in Karat 3.3, I said that individual neurons often behave similarly to predetermining mechanisms, because they can respond to highly specific stimuli and can have highly predictable reactions. Well, the same could be said of genetically predisposed neural connections and neural circuits, because these connections/circuits can also respond to highly specific stimuli and have highly predictable reactions. But there's more to it. In Karat section 3.2, I also said that an assigned value can be described as a conditional or modifiable value, because this type of value is capable of being modified. And even if an assigned value never is modified or adjusted after creation, as long as it can be modified in a direct and active manner, then it can still be considered an assignment type value. In this case, I define direct and active as modifiable by the activity of surrounding neurons or neural systems. So because of this, there are a couple things we can conclude. If the activation pattern, i.e. the overall stimulus response, of a predisposed connection/circuit has never been modified, the process of value assignment obviously hasn't come into play. However, I'd argue that these predisposed connections can still be considered value-assigning mechanisms as long as these connections can be modified directly and actively. In this book, for a system/mechanism to be considered predetermining, it must be fixed in how it responds to information, and a connection which can be changed directly and actively can't necessarily be considered fixed. For example, if a car is currently driving straight forward, would we say that the car must be a single-direction car? Not necessarily. Even if the car has only ever traveled in a straight line, as long as it can turn through mechanisms which were built into the car, we'd still likely define it as a turning car. So even if no modification has occurred, as long as a neural connection can be altered through surrounding neural mechanisms, I'd still generally consider it to be an assignment type connection, which would mean that the assigning order of ops applies to these connections. Only when the activation pattern of a connection can't be modified, directly or actively, could that connection be considered predetermining, which is indeed possible in some cases. In such instances, the predetermining order of ops would apply. Of course, things get more complicated when you look at actual neurology, because it's not always easy to say which connections can be modified and which can't. Also, how modifiable a connection is can vary quite dramatically. But in general, this is my thinking on the matter. Lastly, if you're going to ask what percent of our values are predisposed and what percent do we actually learn, i.e. assign, what that really boils down to is a question of nature versus nurture. The truth is, I can't give you a precise answer to that question. It's possible that each brain fluctuates in terms of those percentages. But what I do know is that you need both predisposed and learned connections for a system like the brain to function the way it does. Without genetic predispositions, i.e. preset values/neural circuits, you wouldn't be able to do very basic things needed for your body's functioning, such as breathing. You'd have to learn that. Without genetic predispositions, you'd also have to learn to experience things like pain and hunger. Without genetic predispositions, you'd probably even have to learn the basic aspects of sensing information, such as hearing sound, seeing color, and feeling touch. These abilities are clearly something most of us are born with, and the people who aren't born with these abilities can't usually teach themselves these abilities. Someone who's born colorblind, for instance, can't teach themselves to see color, as far as we know. The way we behave can also be influenced by genetic predispositions. For example, the fear response is almost universal among humans. Of course, learning can affect when we experience fear, but the fear response itself, the way your mind and body physiologically react to threatening information, seems to be something most of us are born with. In some cases, genetic predispositions can even affect the learning process. For example, research has shown that there are particular ages where it's easier for children to learn languages. See source 19. And lastly, without genetic functioning, you wouldn't even have a brain at all, because genes, presumably, are what code for your brain's structure at birth. At the same time, genetic predispositions cannot be responsible for all of the brain's activities. It'd simply be impossible, because your DNA cannot predict the exact scenarios and environments you're going to be in throughout your life. Predetermining creatures can essentially predict what they'll sense and respond to because of how they're built. See Chapter 2. But since assigning organisms can generally sense much wider varieties and types of info than predetermining creatures, there's usually no way of predicting what exact info will be encountered, which means assigning systems will always need some ability to adapt to individual circumstances. In fact, value assignment itself could be described as a mechanism of learning and environmental adaptation, because it allows organisms to make dynamic adjustments to values and behaviors. Beyond that, it's possible that value assignment can affect processes which are genetically predisposed. One example is the flinching reflex. The flinching reflex, a reflex which occurs in response to a fast-moving object approaching, is a near-universal reaction that can be observed in humans. But for someone to become a competent fighter, they must typically unlearn or untrain their flinching reflex, which is possible with enough practice. In some cases, environmental influences, particularly those which lead to physiological changes in the body, can even affect genomic expression, which can then be passed down to children, in a process we refer to as epigenetics. See source 20. And some of those environmental influences may be mediated by the process of value assignment. For example, you can't have a fear response without threat detection, which, under this thesis, requires value. But again, just because learning influences brain activity doesn't make the brain a blank slate, and just because genes affect the brain's functioning doesn't mean that all brain activity is controlled by genetic predispositions. In other words, it's not an either-or scenario. The brain isn't only a nature machine or only a nurture machine. Both nature-type and nurture-type influences must be part of the system by necessity. However, I can't tell you exactly what % of values/behaviors stem from nature or nurture. Note 4. How do we observe determination of effective action in the brain and other systems? It's hard to say. Like I mentioned in Carat section 4.3, it's possible determination of effective action and determination of value are actually the same thing, indistinguishable from one another biologically. If they are the same, it would mean that determination of effective action does not occur in the brain or in any biological system, and that determination of value is the important operation to observe. However, assuming both of these processes happen, we know from Chapter 4 that determination of effective action in the brain must in some way be connected to the process of value assignment. We also know from the order of operations that effective action will always be determined after or while value is determined, and that each effective action in the brain will necessarily be linked to some kind of value. But here's the issue. I hypothesized in Carat 4.1 and 4.3 that the way operations occur might depend on the level at which they happen, i.e. how many distinct components/systems are involved. Operations involving more neural components, systems, and brain regions might work differently than operations involving less components, systems, and brain regions. And since effective actions will always be tied to specific values, it may just mean that the way determination of effective action is performed will be extremely situational and will vary based on the values you're looking at, and the level on which it occurs. But there are a couple things that should be true. If we assume that most actions which occur in a biological system or mechanism are the effective actions of that system/mechanism, then A, by working backwards, we should often be able to infer the values connected to those effective actions. And B, if action is known and value is known, then it should logically be possible to derive the process by which determination of effective action occurs, assuming such a process is occurring at all. What if decision-making is actually a way of determining effective action? This is an interesting idea, and one that I think has some plausibility. Of course, we know that not all creatures can make decisions, and even in nervous systems, not all actions involve a decision-making process. For example, the way your eyes move when you're asleep isn't something you really decide. This means that not all cases of effective action determination, even inside the brain, can be an instance of decision-making. So if decision-making is a type of effective action determination, then effective action determination can only become decision some of the time. Still, there are a few arguments in favor of such an idea. 1. Determination of effective action becomes active only in value-assigning systems, and decision-making, which is also active, only happens in value-assigning systems as well. 2. Determination of effective action and decision-making are right next to each other in the assigning order of operations. 3. Decision-making is a process that requires an organism to disregard/exclude potential actions. When you decide to take one action, you're necessarily excluding the other actions you could possibly take. Well, in order to determine what actions are effective, in some cases it will also require an organism to exclude potential actions. If there are a large number of actions you could take, most likely not all of them will be effective, which means determining effective action might require you to exclude some of those actions. If decision-making is a type of effective action determination, there would be some implications to it. For one, it would mean that each decision an organism makes must be attached to a specific value or set of values, which isn't that crazy of an idea. But it would mean that anytime decisions change, it's because that value or those values have changed. If you remember what I argued in Chapter 4, the process of value determination is necessarily attached to the process of determining effective action. It would also mean that decision-making and determination of effective action are not separate operations in the assigning order of ops, but are instead interchangeable. And if what I said in Carat 4.5 is correct, it would really complicate the assigning order of ops. But like I also said in 4.5, I don't think decision and action are, in fact, interchangeable. I think that's just a vague proposition. So if decision is indeed a type of effective action determination, the order of ops would probably look more like detect information, potentially confirm the signal, determine the value of that information, determine an effective action/decision, action. When would determination of effective action turn into decision-making? Well, since decision appears to be a conscious process, at least in humans, and since conscious experience might be tied to the top-level order of ops, as I speculated in Note 1, then determination of effective action might become decision-making only at the top level as well. Note 5. Other questions about the order of operations. If we assume, like Carat 4.1 states, that an order of operations occurs at the top of every neuron, every neural circuit, and at the highest level in every brain, then it would mean that the brain technically has billions of order of operations all running at the same time. So how is this possible? How could a system function like that? And how does a top-level order of operations even materialize in a system as complex as the brain? Similar to consciousness, exactly how it comes about is a mystery to me. I can't tell you precisely how it happens, only that it appears to happen and explains much of what the brain does. For instance, the existence of a top-level order of operations can explain why we have a unified experience of the world, but can still perform functions in the background, functions which often happen unconscious to the host. However, even if this is true, it still leaves important questions to be answered. For example, how would we actually separate and measure the higher-level operation sets occurring in the brain? At low levels, measurement might be somewhat simple. The behavior of individual neurons and neural circuits has already been outlined by researchers with good degrees of precision. But measuring higher level operations would not be so easy. How would you even tell the difference between higher level operation sets when they can involve millions of components/systems? And couldn't the same components, systems, and brain regions be involved in multiple high-level operation sets? If so, would those high-level operation sets even be separate? Well, first off, I would speculate that yes, the same components/systems/regions could be involved in multiple high-level order of operations. I'd also speculate that those operation sets could, depending on the case, be considered separate. As for how to differentiate higher-level operation sets from one another, I'd argue that it may have to do with activity paths. What is an activity path? Well, under my thesis, any neurological activity which has an observable trajectory, in other words, activity which starts in one region and travels somewhere else, must necessarily have some sensory impetus, must necessarily utilize some type of value, and must necessarily result in some end action, at least in the vast majority of cases. If this is true, it would mean that an order of ops should exist within or at the top of that path, and should be distinguishable therein. Sometimes this action may not be an outwardly observable behavior. Sometimes the sensory impetus may not be an obvious external stimulus, especially since attention can impact which stimuli we react to. But in general, this is what I think. Again, I could be wrong. Note 6. The other functions. What about the other functions the brain performs? Many of us, when looking into anything psychology related, especially having to do with the brain, hear about these functions happening in the brain, such as motor control, long-term memory, short-term memory, pattern recognition, coordination, cognition, etc. But if the brain really is performing these functions, then wouldn't they have to occur at some point in the order of operations? Well, basically, I think there are two main possibilities as to where these functions come about. 1. It's possible that many of these functions are either required for or exist to support one of the 6 operations listed at the beginning of Chapter 4. For example, what scientists call motor control and coordination could just be the neural systems required for action to take place at a high level in brains. And what psychologists label cognition could be one of the neural mechanisms which supports human decision-making. Of course, motor control, coordination, and cognition are each complex things, but if we're talking about where these functions fit in regards to the order of ops, this is one possibility. The second possibility is that many of these functions stem from the activity of many low-level operation sets combined. In other words, these functions might be an emergent property of neural activity/organization. What do I mean by emergent property? Well, I tend to think of economics. All economic activity in a society is made up of transactions. If you go to the store and buy a watermelon, that's one transaction, which means you're technically participating in economics. Now, one single transaction on its own is not a highly complicated thing. I give you money and you give me something else in return. But if you were to analyze millions or billions of transactions, certain patterns would appear. For example, you'd be able to see where money flows and where that flow is most concentrated. If you were to study those patterns over long periods of time, those patterns may even take certain shapes, almost as if there are certain overall goals those transactions are meant to perform. Well, it could be a similar thing with many functions of the brain. If you were to look at the areas of the brain where memory takes place and examine the neural activity happening on a small scale, you probably wouldn't see anything special. Those neurons wouldn't be performing a special memory procedure or operating extremely differently from neurons in the cerebral cortex. Some of those neurons might have different anatomical structures than the rest, and the precise behaviors of those neurons might have small variances, but the way they fundamentally work, the reliance on action potentials, the usage of axons and dendrites, etc., would probably be similar to most other neurons in the brain. However, if you were to scale up and observe large amounts of interactions in that part of the brain, all of a sudden a certain function might start to appear, the function of memory. So basically, certain functions of the brain might not exist to support higher-level operation sets per se, but instead exist because they emerged from lower-level activity. It's also possible that some functions could be both an emergent property and supportive of a higher-level operation, but this all depends on the case. As a side note, this is why the 6 operations are so broad or vague in how they're written. The term action, for instance, could mean many different things. It doesn't tell you what action is occurring. Also, determination of value doesn't tell you what value is being determined. The reason for this vagueness is ultimately because it should be possible for operations and operation sets to have extremely diverse effects in terms of the behaviors/functions they produce, and the way they play out in brains and other systems. Note 7. The emotion discussion. What about emotions? I've discussed a lot of things so far, but the topic of emotions and emotional states and how they fit into the thesis hasn't been discussed yet. So here we go. First off, what exactly is an emotion? Well, part of the difficulty with the concept of emotion is that it's not really one easily definable thing. When someone gets poked with a needle and feels pain, that painful feeling could be described as an emotion. And because emotion is primarily something you experience, just like with consciousness, it's going to be challenging to say exactly where emotion comes from. If you define an emotion as any experience or sensation, then you must inevitably deal with the hard problem of consciousness, which I discussed in Note 1. If you define emotions as specific kinds of experiences and sensations, then you'd have to determine what sensations/experiences count as an emotion, which is also difficult. However, there do seem to be particular feelings that people generally describe as emotions, even if they're not entirely well defined. And because of that, we can sometimes measure the effects of different emotions and emotional states, and the brain activity which is correlated with them. I think this discussion goes further though. In fact, I think in many cases, emotions are often connected to another psychological phenomenon, one we've been discussing throughout this book. See, many people, due to bad education, have been led to believe that emotion is its own separate process in the brain, as if emotions are just these random, unpredictable things that happen to us, separate from logic and reason, or whatever cognitive functions lead us to logic and reason. But I don't believe that's normally true. In order to prove that emotion isn't normally random, all you have to do is think about when people typically feel emotions. Do people typically feel emotions at completely random times for no reason out of the blue? Or is there usually some event, experience, or perceptive change that happens before the emotion? In rare cases, the first is true, but most of the time it's the second. So if the second is normally true, then we've got to ask, what exactly is it that happens before emotional changes? Well, I think the answer, at least in many cases, is disturbingly simple. Say you're driving on the freeway, and your dog is in the passenger seat beside you. Let's also say, for the sake of the example, that your dog is looking out the front of the window and watching traffic the same as you. Then, right as you're about to exit the freeway, a car cuts you off and prevents you from taking your exit. Naturally, you feel annoyed. But you look over, and your dog doesn't appear to be upset at all. In fact, Doggo seems to be completely unaffected by this harrowing traffic mishap. So why do you and the dog have different emotions? The dog essentially watched the same event happen. Why isn't the dog perturbed like you are? Most likely, it's because the emotion you're feeling was not caused by the information itself, but by your interpretation of the information. The dog might have witnessed the same relative thing, but the dog interpreted the information very differently than you did. You saw it as an offense, but the dog probably just saw it as some visual noise, and thus the dog is experiencing a different emotion than you. In other words, the process of value assignment might actually be influencing emotions, at least some of the time. Remember, the definition of value has to do with interpretation of sensory information, and value assignment is the process by which an organism actively changes values. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this. For instance, many psychoactive drugs can change how you feel, i.e. your emotional state. Why can drugs do that? Because, as scientists have discovered, emotions and emotional states are often connected to neurochemistry. And since psychoactive drugs can temporarily alter your brain's neurochemistry, those same drugs can also have an effect on emotional state. There are even medical conditions that can alter the neurochemistry of the brain. On top of that, there are also instances where your neurochemical state is directly altered by bodily changes/bodily trauma. If someone came up to you out of nowhere and smacked you in the arm with a baseball bat, that would probably affect how you feel, causing pain and possibly anger. Also, when you go through puberty, a vast array of hormonal changes occur which can influence neurochemistry, and thus emotion. In these cases, you can't say that emotions are purely a result of interpretation. I'd argue that interpretation can still play some role, just not as big of a role. I should also mention that you can't always control how you interpret things. Many, one could argue most, of the values your brain creates and uses are not created or used consciously, and even values which are conscious may not necessarily be directly controllable, since value assignment is typically based on experience, i.e. sensation, and your experiences are often something you can't control, at least not directly. Still, if interpretive changes can lead to emotional changes, then it might mean that value assignment is connected to emotional state to some extent much of the time. Exactly how values and emotions are connected is not always clear. In fact, the manner in which they're connected might vary depending on the case. It could be that emotions themselves evolved as a way of supporting value assignment by supporting memory. We do tend to remember emotional experiences better than anything else in life, which means emotion might be the brain's way of getting us to remember specific values more easily. But this is only speculation. Note 8. An argument against neurochemistry, genetics, and environment as the primary factors driving psychology. In Western psychology, there's an idea, which has been around for a number of years, that psychology is basically driven by three major elements: neurochemistry, genetics, and environment. I have some things to say about this. One could even call it a beef. First, I will acknowledge that this viewpoint isn't completely illogical. I understand how one might reach this conclusion. In physics, you often need to understand how smaller elements function in order to get a grasp of the bigger picture. This is because the smaller elements are the pieces which construct the bigger picture, at least in physics. So basically, if you were trying to figure out the smallest or simplest possible elements affecting psychology, then neurochemistry, genetics, and environment might appear to be the three most important elements. And of course, each of these elements do play a significant role in psychology. However, viewing psychology as simply a combination of genetics, chemistry, and environment, I'd argue, is a bad way of thinking about psychology. To show you what I'm talking about, let's take a brief look at each element. Do genetics influence psychology? Almost certainly, yes. Genes are responsible for building the structures which you use to think, feel, and behave. And because of that, genetics must necessarily influence the way in which you're able to do these things, such as the limitations of your sense organs, the body parts you use to act out your ideas, and the very composition of your brain. But what are the methods by which genetics affect large-scale psychological processes, such as thought and feeling? How much of your experience is influenced by learning, and how much is a result of genetic predisposition? As we discussed in Note 3, genes can't predict what you'll encounter throughout your life, so learning has to be a part of brain function. These questions are a bit harder to answer. Simply slapping the label of genetics on it and calling it a day doesn't really do justice to the actual mechanisms at play. What about environment? We know that an individual's environment does impact their psychology quite substantially, but just how much of that is controlled by environment versus being influenced by environment? Learning is obviously fundamental to psychology, but if learning were completely controlled by your environment, then two individuals placed in the exact same environment should learn the exact same things in the exact same manners. But normally speaking, this isn't what we see. Two animals with brains, placed in the same environment at birth, can have drastically different experiences from one another and learn drastically different things, which means there must be some other psychological component or components affecting the learning process. And those components may not necessarily fit neatly into the category of genetics or neurochemistry. So what are those components, and what's the precise mechanism by which environment interacts with said components to create psychology? This is a little harder to answer. Simply reducing the mechanism to environment strips away all nuance from the matter. But the truth is, both of the above points are not new. People have talked about these things before, plenty of times. But an argument I never hear anybody make has to do with the third element, neurochemistry, or chemistry for short. Now, most people reading this book know that chemistry is necessary for the brain to physically operate. Neurons in the brain usually communicate with each other using neurochemicals, and because of that, some people believe that neurochemicals are the minimum components necessary for the brain to function. Remember, if you're viewing the brain like a physicist, the minimum components are going to be extremely important. Possibly even the most important. But I think this is simply the wrong way of looking at it. Let's pretend that you're someone who's never heard of the government before today, and you want to understand how government works. Where would you start? You'd probably start by first learning about what a government is and the different goals that a government aims to achieve. Then you'd probably study the different groups and institutions involved in achieving those goals. From there, you might examine how individual workers perform jobs to further the goals of each governmental body. You might also look at how different groups work with and against each other to accomplish such goals. What you probably wouldn't do is spend all your time analyzing the cell phones and communication methods that government workers use. Why? Because in the grand scheme of things, cell phone facts and statistics are not really important to understanding the overall behavior of a government. Well, it's a similar problem with neurochemistry. Essentially, every aspect of psychology stems from the activity of multiple parts working together. When you combine and coordinate those parts, you get thought, feeling, and behavior. It's true that you need chemical activity for your brain to function at all, just like government workers have to communicate with each other somehow in order for the government to function. But neurochemistry does not determine overall brain function the same way that cell phones do not dictate overall government function. This is because brain function is fundamentally a problem of organization. In order to understand brain function, it's less about examining the communication methods and more about examining A. the goals of neural communication, B. what neurons are communicating to one another, and C. how they're coordinating to accomplish their objectives. Here's one more example to drive the point home. Most of us know that currently, doctors will often treat psychological conditions with prescription drugs, because such drugs can alter your neurochemistry. Now, these drugs can be effective in many cases, but I've always found it interesting that, even when a medication is effective, when you take someone off their medications, there's a good chance they'll slip back into the same behavior patterns as before. Well, why could that be? When you alter the brain's neurochemistry, there will obviously be some effect, since neurochemistry is vital to neuron communication. But my guess is that, when you introduce neurochemistry-altering medications, you're usually not changing the fundamental values, goals, or organization of the system. If anything, you're only modifying the communication method of the workers. It'd be like if everyone in government was forced to use fax machines to talk instead of cell phones. Fax machines obviously would have a big impact on the efficiency and effectiveness of certain parts of government, but fax machines would probably not change the objectives, policies, or priorities that any government group has, and because of that, fax machines would do little to change what the government does overall. In fact, this same reasoning could be applied to genetics and environment as well. Even if we accept that genetics and environment and neurochemistry are the simplest components of psychology, what none of these components take into account is neuron organization. And arguably, organization is the most important of these things to look at if you're trying to understand the broader behavior of the creature. This is ultimately why I think viewing psychology as just a combination of genetics, neurochemistry, and environment is a bad model for psychology. Note 9. Why can we do things that aren't survival or reproduction related? Throughout this book, I've regularly mentioned how values are a result of sensory info and goals, specifically the goals of survival and reproduction. But many animals, humans in particular, seem to be capable of taking actions and valuing things that have nothing to do with survival or reproduction. One example is how many mammal species will play with one another, particularly when they're young. Another example is how humans will often try to make each other laugh, and sometimes that humor can take on complex forms. Yet another example is how people will sometimes engage in art creation or philosophy. So why would all this stuff be possible if values, according to this thesis, are supposed to be about survival and reproduction? There are a couple potential answers. One hypothesis is that all actions and values are related to survival and reproduction in some roundabout manner. For example, some scientists believe that animals might engage in play when young as a way of practicing for real-life scenarios. In my personal opinion, though, that's not necessarily what's happening. I don't think all of our actions, thoughts, and values have to be guided by survival or reproduction, even indirectly. Sure, when humans first showed up to the party, maybe all our values were related to survival and reproduction, because that was probably necessary. But it appears that evolution often selects for intelligence. Animals which are more intelligent are generally more likely to pass on their genes. And intelligence, in my view, almost always involves abstraction. What is abstraction? It essentially means detached or removed from. Let's say I'm trying to figure out a better way to hunt for food, instead of just using my bare hands. If I can think of a creative way around that problem, for instance, if I can craft some kind of weapon, not only will that give me a survival advantage, but it will require me to do things which are indirect, i.e. abstract, from the main goal I'm trying to accomplish. Instead of going straight for my food, I have to think of a potential weapon, then spend energy trying to build that weapon, finding the parts, putting it together, etc. The more steps I must take to think of and build my weapon, the more abstract my ideas/actions must be. And that's not the only type of abstraction. Let's say I'm fighting with someone over some food. If I can think several steps ahead of my opponent and then take some kind of action to preempt their moves, not only will that give me an advantage in the fight, but it will require me to do something which is indirect/abstract. Instead of going straight at my opponent, I must imagine what my opponent might do, and then come up with a plan to counteract the thing I've imagined them doing. Each step ahead that I plan is another step away from my initial task, to fight. In other words, the more steps ahead I can think, the more abstract my ideas/actions will be. Why is this important? Because if intelligence and abstraction are related, then the more intelligent I become, the more it'll be possible for me to engage in abstraction. And the more I can engage in abstraction, the more I'll be able to do things and think things which are not directly related to survival or reproduction. In fact, the term intelligence may just be another way of saying one's ability to perform abstract thinking, either by thinking outside of the box, aka creative intelligence, or by thinking several steps ahead, what I call process intelligence. Eventually, if I become intelligent enough, it might be possible for nearly all the things I do, the thoughts I have, and the value systems I use to be abstract or disconnected from my biological goals. Of course, any biological organism is still going to need to do some things strictly for survival and reproduction purposes, otherwise the species would die out. But ultimately, this abstraction hypothesis would explain why some animals can do things, think things, carry values, and perform goals which have nothing to do with survival or reproduction. Note 10. Value assignment and the placebo effect. If we're going to talk about the placebo effect, we first need to know what the placebo effect is. If you're unfamiliar, it's basically a scientific phenomenon where a person experiences some kind of benefit, either psychological or physiological, from a drug or treatment, even though that drug or treatment was meant to be ineffective. Say a doctor gives pills filled with sugar to a patient, and then tells the patient that the pills actually contain medicine. If the patient gets better or experiences a reduction in symptoms, then that effect probably wasn't from the pills, because the pills contain no medicine, but instead stemmed from the patient's belief or perception that the pills would make them better. The placebo effect is a well-known phenomenon and has been useful in medical research for a very long time. But, of course, since its discovery, scientists have been curious about it, and it's easy to see why. The placebo effect seems almost magical in the way it works. How is it possible for beliefs alone to influence someone's psychological and physiological state, to the extent that even bodily processes can be altered? Well, I'd argue that value assignment may have something to do with it. Let's start with a question. How does any creature determine what's real and what isn't? It may seem like a simplistic question at this point in the book, but it matters to this discussion. Science and scientific tools such as critical thinking, logic, math, and simple observation certainly might help one to know more about reality. But obviously not all creatures can use science, can use it properly, or can use it at all times, which means outside of observation, organisms can't always depend on science or scientific tools to determine what's real, or what seems real, on a moment-to-moment basis. In order to have any regular or consistent conception of reality, creatures, at least ones with brains, must usually rely on something else, their own beliefs and perceptions. But what are perceptions and beliefs, and more importantly, how are they formed? It's likely that consciousness is required for perception or belief, and on top of that, some people use the term perception to refer to a type of consciousness. But if we take the consciousness discussion out of it, what are the fundamental components of a perception or belief? We know that sensation is at least required for you to perceive or believe something, but that can't be the only thing that matters. For you to believe something, it's not just about sensing information. You must be able to understand what you're sensing on some basic level. So where do these understandings come from? Well, like I argued in Karat's section 1.3, in order to understand information, you must have some way of connecting or relating sensory info to something else. And under this thesis, values are the most basic way that organisms do that. So if that's the case, then the things we call perceptions and beliefs may just be values. Why does this matter? Well, if values are the primary way in which organisms understand reality, then it would make perfect sense for the body to align its own actions and reactions with new values. In fact, if we couldn't do that, if our body couldn't adjust itself in response to new values, then we probably wouldn't be able to function at all. Of course, the placebo effect can't be caused by just any kind of value. Yes, it's possible that all perceptions and beliefs are values, but not all values are perceptions and beliefs. For example, predetermining creatures use values, but these creatures most likely can't perceive or believe anything, or create new values. Value assigning systems can potentially believe and perceive things, and can also create new values. And furthermore, if this thesis is right, the brain is a value assigning system. But not all values, even inside the brain, involve perception and belief. For example, all involuntary functions of the body require values, at least under this thesis. But involuntary functions are not something you're normally aware of or something you perceive. Therefore, it must be a particular type of values which are responsible for the placebo effect. Which type of values? In my estimation, perceptions, beliefs, and ultimately the placebo effect most likely have to do with top-level values in the brain. In Karat section 4.1, I hypothesized that an order of operations governs every biological activity loop, from the smallest neural circuit to the highest level brain activity. I also mentioned that operations probably work differently at different levels. Well, it's my speculation that beliefs, perceptions, and conscious experience itself may come into play at the top-level order of operations in brains/nervous systems. Since we seem to have only one conscious experience at a time, and because perceptive events which happen inside that conscious experience can impact bodily functioning, for example, when I identify something as threatening, my heart rate will speed up and adrenaline will be released into my blood. It may be the case that the placebo effect is simply an outcropping or variation of that process. Furthermore, we know that you normally adjust your own body according to your perceptions. When you get up to use the bathroom, when you speak to a friend, when you go to sleep. In each of these cases, you perceived a certain need or desire, and then moved or shifted yourself in some way to accomplish that goal. So if perception affects the mundane tasks your body performs, why couldn't perception affect you in less mundane ways? If value assignment is indeed the primary function of the brain, and if top-level value assignment can influence the large-scale actions of the body, then there should be no reason why these values and the effects they produce would be limited to the mundane. Of course, just because a cancer patient believes their cancer will subside doesn't mean it will. There are plenty of experiments showing that the placebo effect doesn't impact everyone and doesn't always have the same effect, or the same degree of effect. For most people, the placebo effect can only go so far in determining health outcomes. This ultimately means that beliefs/perceptions can't control every aspect of your body's functioning. But it does make sense that beliefs have some influence over bodily processes some of the time, because presumably the topmost values of the system are generally going to be a top priority when it comes to meeting an organism's needs, or perceived needs. There it is, the book is done, and that, as they say, is that. As for who says that, well, one can only guess.